Set out on the path to holistic learning and realize your UPSC goals. Benefit from consistent and tailored assistance, have your questions addressed promptly, and ensure your preparation remains on track with unwavering learner aid. To empower aspirants in reaching their UPSC goals, Vision IAS Delhi presents the GS Foundation course. The course highlights include holistic current affairs coverage, continuous mentoring and support system, comprehensive syllabus coverage, tech-enabled classroom and services. Enroll in the Vision IAS Delhi GS Foundation course. Batches starting 9th February, 1 p.m., 23rd February, 9 a.m., 28th February, 5 p.m. Start on the path to success in the UPSC Civil Services examination today. Welcome to the dynamic world of UPSC, where the journey unfolds across three critical stages: prelims, mains, and interview. Each stage demands a deep understanding of current affairs, shaping the nature of questions, from factual, analytical to opinion-based questions. As we delve deeper into the UPSC's diverse syllabus, a major hurdle aspirants face is keeping pace with the evolving nature of current affairs. This includes staying updated with changes such as policy shifts, geopolitical developments, environmental updates, and more. Such dynamism, along with an undefined syllabus and a vast array of resources, makes mastering current affairs a formidable task for UPSC aspirants. To navigate these complexities, we have introduced PT 365 to revise, analyze, and master one-year current affairs for Prelims 2024 in 60 hours. With its innovative design and structured approach, PT 365 simplifies your preparation. Our PT 365 offers comprehensive current affairs classes that stand out for their interactive classes by highly experienced Vision IAS faculty, holistic coverage of one-year current affairs for a strong foundation which includes prelims relevant topics from the Hindu, Indian Express, PIB, Economic Times, Yojana, Economic Survey, Budget, Sansad TV etc. from April 2023 to April 2024. Embrace the vast UPSC syllabus with PT 365's targeted and thorough approach, transforming it from a complex task into a pathway for achievement. Ready to begin? Register now at our website. For any further queries, reach out to us at these numbers or enquiry@visionis.in. We are here to assist you on your journey to success. Welcome everyone. Meet Arav, an aspiring UPSC candidate. His eyes are full of dreams, his room a reflection of his ambition with UPSC topper stories. Arav starts his journey and soon finding himself engulfed by mountains of books and endless notes as he grapples with the vast UPSC syllabus. Despite trying various revision methods, Arav's anxiety escalates each day. He feels lost in a sea of information, struggling for direction. In his moment of confusion, Arav discovers the Lakshya Prelims Mentoring Program 2024, a ray of hope in his challenging journey. He found that Lakshya program offers a strategic plan for revision and practice, which includes the entire GS and CSAT syllabus. It skillfully integrates monthly current affairs and PT 365 with the static GS syllabus for a comprehensive revision. CSAT, once a daunting task, is now approached with rigorous practice and focus, building confidence. Amazed by the personalized approach, Arav finds Lakshya's plan as per his unique needs, that is, by focusing on high-yielding areas, facilitating multiple revisions, providing effective and validated reading list for efficient preparation, and analyzing the evolving demand for UPSC prelims paper with in-depth trend analysis of previous year questions, PYQs. With Lakshya's structured plan, Arav's approach to preparation evolves. The chaos of his study room now becomes a focused learning environment. Empowered and confident, Arav is now ready to conquer the UPSC prelims. The once daunting task now appears within his reach. Interested in learning more or registering? Visit visionisas.in/Lakshya or call us on these numbers. Start your successful journey with Vision IAS today.
Good evening everyone. सब बढ़िया? Settled? I hope all of you are doing well and have somehow managed to squeeze in this classroom. And to all our friends who are in the other classroom watching, one, you are late, and second, don't be disappointed, I'll be taking up your queries as well. ठीक है? चलो. This is the session on budget. First, you must know why are you here. If you are here because you think that I will tell you about some scheme announced in the budget and therefore you will be able to remember that, then you are in the wrong class. This is not a class for getting to know about some schemes or some announcements or what was the allocation for certain sectors. This is not the class for that. In fact, when you read budget, when you study budget, it should not be with the objective of or with an eye on कि सरकार किस चीज़ पे पैसा खर्च कर रही है या कौन सी स्कीम सरकार ने अनाउंस करी किसी चीज़, इस पर्पस से बजट को नहीं पढ़ना है. As many of you are my students, you know I repeat this several times in the class. There are 1 lakh facts being generated every moment. One, you can't remember, and second, you don't have to remember all of them. Most of them are useless. Read something for the purpose of only reading it, not remembering it. So when you are reading budget, when you're coming across budget, try to visualize the concepts that you have learned in the class. Try to visualize those concepts in action. This should be your objective when you read budget. I don't know where your economics syllabus is at the moment, but because this is a budget class, I'll have to assume some things. जिनकी क्लास में नहीं हुआ है उनकी क्लास में बाद में हो जाएगा. जो हमारे ऑनलाइन फ्रेंड्स हैं जो देख रहे हैं, I mean these are the basic things that you should know. If you don't yet know, you are expected to know by yourself in some time. Fiscal policy जैसे कई बैचेस में नहीं होगा अभी तक. Normally we conduct that chapter, we do that chapter at the end of the sessions. But you have studied fiscal policy. You know about government's taxes, government's expenses, government's borrowings, deficits. From where does government finance its deficit? You know these things. Budget presents you an opportunity to recap all those things in front of your eyes. See those things happening in front of your eyes. हम पढ़ते हैं सरकार का ये रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर है, ये कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर है, क्या रेवेन्यू है, क्या कैपिटल है, क्या इफेक्टिव रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट है. तो इट इज this budget is that document that helps you to understand things by looking at them in action. It is not some document where you simply try to remember things कि भी हाँ ये स्कीम है, इसके ऊपर इतना एलोकेशन है. चाहे वो बजट हो, चाहे वो इकोनॉमिक सर्वे हो, चाहे वो मंथली करंट अफेयर्स हो हमारा, चाहे वो हमारा PT 365 मेन 365 हो, हर साल एग्जाम के बाद एक मीम चलता है वेयर केजरीवाल इज स्टैंडिंग. वो केजरीवाल जी का है ना कि वो हाथ में बिल जला रहे हैं बिजली का, तो एक मीम चलता है केजरीवाल जी के हाथ में PT 365 है और उस पर लिखा होता है कि इस बार भी कुछ नहीं आया. यू आर रीडिंग PT 365 और बजट और इकोनॉमिक सर्वे और एनी ऑफ दीज फैक्ट्स डॉक्यूमेंट्स thinking that you will be able to remember some fact and that fact will be asked in the exam and hence you will be successful. वो अप्रोच ही गलत है. इस अप्रोच से नहीं पढ़ना है इस डॉक्यूमेंट को या किसी भी और डॉक्यूमेंट को. रीड इट विद द ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ ट्राइंग टू लर्न द कॉन्सेप्ट्स, bringing yourself in that situation that if questions are asked with respect to these topics, you shall be able to answer them. ये हर एक चीज़ आपको कैपेबल बनाती है इंटेलिजेंट गैस करने में, रैंडम गैस नहीं, इंटेलिजेंट गैस करने में. जैसे अभी हम देखेंगे इसके अंदर डॉक्यूमेंट में कि फिस्कल डेफिसिट की वैल्यू क्या है, सरकार ने क्या टारगेट किया, कितना मीट किया, क्या ट्रेंड है फिस्कल डेफिसिट का. क्वेश्चन इन द एग्जाम विल बी अरेंज द फॉलोइंग डेफिसिट्स इन ऑर्डर ऑफ देयर मैग्नीट्यूड. कौन सा बड़ा फिजिकल है, रेवेन्यू है, प्राइमरी है, नेट फिजिकल है, ये सवाल एग्जाम में पूछा जाएगा. पूछा हुआ सवाल है. आप याद करने में लगे हो कि भाई फिजिकल डेफिसिट दिया हुआ था पीटी 35 में, इतनी वैल्यू है, ये तो पूछा नहीं गया, ये पूछ लिया कि भी क्या ट्रेंड है, तो फिर आप बोल रहे हो कि नहीं ये सवाल तो बताया नहीं किसी टीचर ने. तो प्लीज मेक श्योर दैट योर ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ कमिंग टू दिस क्लास is settled. You have this clarity in your mind that you are not going to learn some fact. Rather, you are going to become capable to be able to answer questions which may have some facts in them. This must be the objective of attending these sessions. नहीं तो 3 घंटे का सेशन है, आप 45-48 मिनट्स की निर्मला जी की स्पीच सुन लो, वहाँ पे भी तो वही सारे फैक्ट्स हैं जो मैं बोलने वाला हूँ. तो दैट वुड बी फार मोर प्रोडक्टिव एज कम्पेयर्ड टू अटेंडिंग दिस क्लास. There are 5-minute summaries of budget everywhere on YouTube, on various websites. You read that. That would be a better use of time. अगर आपको फैक्ट याद करना है, यहाँ पे हम फोकस करेंगे on different aspects of budgeting. We are going to, basically speaking, we are going to recap the entire chapter of government budgeting with the example of the present budget. तो करंट बजट में जो जो नंबर्स हैं हम उनका एग्जाम्पल लेके, कुछ स्कीम का एग्जाम्पल लेके हम बेसिकली बजटिंग का चैप्टर पढ़ने वाले हैं. दिस इज व्हाट वी आर गोइंग टू डू इन दिस चैप्टर. ऑलराइट, देयर विल बी सम पॉलिटी पार्ट्स. आई एम नॉट गोइंग टू कवर दोस पार्ट्स. सम पार्ट्स सर्टेनली आई विल कवर, बट नॉट द एंटायर पार्ट्स. की किस तरीके से अप्रोप्रिएशन बिल पास होता है, फाइनेंस बिल है, उसकी बात नहीं करेंगे. ओके, लेट्स क्विकली स्टार्ट नाउ. सो वी हैव बजट. आई एम श्योर एवरीबडी नोज आर्टिकल 112. It defines annual financial statement, AFS. What does Article 112 read? It reads that the president shall... अरे मत देखो, मेरे को देखो, नीचे मत देखो, मैं बता रहा हूँ. President causes to be laid down before both houses of parliament with respect to each financial year. अब इसके बाद मेन पार्ट स्टार्ट होता है. Estimates of expenses and receipts. Expenses must be such that, number one, they separate the expenses charged on Constitution and other expenses on the Consolidated Fund of India, CFI, and other expenses. पहला ये clause है. उसके बाद है that expenses must be such that they are separated, that they clearly show differences between expenses on revenue account and other account, revenue expenses and other expenses. That means when you read this thing, now you get to know कि भाई when you look at annual financial statement, there is going to be one estimates, मतलब future के respect में pertain कर रहा है, estimates of something. You will come across various numbers which are ultimately estimates. Budget estimates, revised estimates, advanced estimate, अलग अलग टाइप के numbers आपको दिखेंगे जब आप डॉक्यूमेंट देखोगे. तो budget estimates क्या हुआ? When the government is presenting budget, अभी present किया है बजट 2024 1st Feb 2024 को. For which year? For the year 2024-25, for the coming financial year. That means estimates for the year to come, estimates of this particular year. These are called as budget estimates. There is an ongoing year, अभी जो चल रहा है, FY 23-24 is ongoing at this moment. This year's budget would have been announced 1 year before. Last year announced किया गया होगा. With respect to last year, now we have some advanced idea as to how much money government would have collected or is probably going to collect. So government will revise those estimates. They become revised estimates. So broadly speaking, हमारे पास budget estimates होते हैं, revised estimates होते हैं. Budget में हमने expect किया था that we are going to, let's say, collect 10 lakh crore rupees of taxes. 10 महीने बीत गए इस साल के, 10 months have passed, and we have yet collected, let's say, 6 lakh crore rupees of taxes. That means in the remaining 2 months, we expect that we are probably going to be at 8 lakh crores. Hence, what we are going to do is we are going to revise our estimate presented during last year budget. That becomes revised estimate. That is one set of numbers that you see. Budget estimates, revised estimates. ये को एक set of numbers मिल गए. Then next clause क्या है? Expenses must be such that they are separated on revenue account and capital account, on other account. That means when you look at all the estimates of expenses and receipts, you are going to see that there are something called as revenue receipts, revenue expenses, and capital receipts, capital expenses. Then naturally the question should be that what is revenue, what is capital? Government natural entity है, artificial entity है. Government is an artificial entity. We create government. Why do we create government? So that government can provide certain goods to us which we fail to provide to ourselves. And therefore we create somebody with adequate authority, that you have this authority, you exercise authority and perform this responsibility for us. So we create government for this very purpose. सरकार की हैसियत से क्या पैसा कलेक्ट करती है, कितना पैसा कहाँ पे खर्च करती है. Government, by the virtue of being government, in its status as being the government, from where and how much money does the government collect, and where and how much money does the government spend? That is basically your revenue account. Revenue expenses and revenue receipts. Government collects taxes because we have authorized the government to collect taxes from us. Money that government collects as its status, its authority as government. Taxes. You pay fees to the government, some fines to the government. All these are revenue receipts of the government. सरकार की जो rightful receipts होती हैं उनको हम revenue receipts बोलते हैं. Similarly, सरकार के जो as government expenses होते हैं उनको बोलते हैं revenue expenses. So we have revenue receipts, revenue expenses. Versus capital receipts, capital expenses. वो क्या होते हैं? Anything that has an effect on assets and liabilities of the government. सरकार के asset या liability पे अगर कुछ effect पड़ रहा है, we call them as capital expenses, capital receipts. Repeatedly, this question has been asked in prelims, and surprisingly was asked last year in mains as well. That differentiate between revenue account and capital account on the budget, in the budget of the government. But in prelims, this is a very common question. Which of the following is a revenue expense? Which of the following is a tax, non-tax revenue of the government? Which of the following is a non-debt creating capital expense of the government? Non-debt reducing capital expense of the government. तो अलग अलग इस टाइप से कई बार सवाल पूछा गया है कैपिटल और रेवेन्यू के क्लासिफिकेशन के ऊपर. सो यू मस्ट नो दीज थिंग्स कि भाई क्या है कैपिटल, क्या है रेवेन्यू. सरकार जो राइटफुली कलेक्ट करती है, मीनिंग इन इट्स स्टेटस एज अ गवर्नमेंट. यूपीएससी का एग्जाम केवल यूपीएससी ही करवा सकती है, सरकार ही कर सकती है और कोई नहीं करवा सकता है. You will pay some fees to the government, fees that the government collects, fines that nobody else can collect a fine, only an authorized entity can collect fines. Government collects money, revenue receipt, in its right as a government, in its authority as a government. That is revenue receipt. Tax receipts, non-tax receipts. Government spends money because it is responsible to spend some money. It spends money on payment of salary to its staff, pensions to its staff, defense expenses, interest payments. All these are examples of government's revenue expenses. Similarly, capital expenses, capital receipts क्या बोला? जो कि asset liability को affect कर रहा है. Any expenditure which results in increase in government's assets or a reduction in government's liability. Asset liability तो समझते हो? Something from which you expect to generate an income in future versus liability जिसके ऊपर आपको कुछ future में cost pay करनी है, वो हो गई liability आपकी. Borrow किया है आपने तो आपकी liability हो गई, ठीक है? Something government spends money on something government spends money which is of the nature that it is creating some assets for the government. पैसा खर्च किया है, government expenditure. What kind of expenditure? Which is creating some assets for the government. Capital expenditure. Or government spends money which results in reduction of liabilities of the government. Asset creating or liability reducing. That becomes capital expenditure. इसका opposite हो जाएगा capital receipt. सरकार ने पैसा receive किया. Government gets money. Government of India disinvests from some company. जब सरकार disinvestment करेगी तो government will receive money or not? It receives money, but that is because of fall in its assets. Its assets reduce, it receives money. Government borrows money. सरकार की liability बढ़ रही है, कम हो रही है? Government is borrowing money. Its liability is increasing or decreasing? Increasing, obviously. Government receives money, but this money is received on account of incurring of liability by the government. So liability increasing receipt, that becomes the capital receipt. So any receipt of the government which is on account of either increase in liabilities or a fall in assets becomes your capital receipt of the government. The budget, which is the annual financial statement, is basically all this record of, all this estimate of how much money does the government expect to collect and spend on these various purposes, revenue purposes and capital purposes. कितना expect करो collect करना, कितना expect करो spend करना. That becomes our, basically that is what is part of our annual financial statement. What we are going to do now, we are going to look at the budget. We will see, number one, what are the major sources of receipts of the government. Major, अब हम budget specifically जो इस साल का budget है उसकी बात करेंगे. What are the major sources of receipt for the government? Taxes, non-taxes, capital की बात करेंगे. And then we look at what are major expenses of the government. फॉर व्हाट पर्पस इज गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग मनी? हम कुछ स्कीम्स एग्जांपल भी ले लेंगे, सरकार ने अनाउंस करी, वैसे देयर इज नॉट मच अनाउंसमेंट इन दी बजट, बट मोर ऑफ अ कंटिन्यूएशन ऑफ द ओल्ड स्कीम. But yes, we'll look at the examples and try to see that what are all these expenses of the government, what are all these receipts of the government. ठीक है, क्लियर है? कुछ पूछना है किसी को? पूछ सकते हो, कुछ पूछना है तो बोलो.
Sir, please explain receipt.
रिसीट में क्या बताऊं, बताओ.
Sir, government.
Receipt मतलब government has received some money, that is called as a receipt. You pay taxes to the government, government receives money. Government borrows money from the market, government again receives money. पैसा तो receive किया है ना सरकार ने. तो there are different kinds of receipts of the government. अलग अलग sources से सरकार पैसा arrange, government is arranging money from various sources. It is borrowing some money, it is selling some PSU, and from that it collects some money. Some PSU earns some profit, and because government is owner, therefore government earns some money in form of dividends. Government collects taxes, you pay your fees, you are going to pay some fees when you fill your UPSC form, government collects some money from that. All these are receipts of the government. ठीक है, चलो. One important thing, this was a interim budget. Difference पता है interim budget में और normal budget में, और more importantly vote on account में. What is a vote on account? What is an interim budget? Does anybody know the difference? अगर specifically पता है तब हाथ उठाना, otherwise I'll explain. You know what is an interim budget versus what is a vote on account? Anyone who knows the specific answer? अरे शर्माओ मत यार, गलती तो होगा, बोलो.
Remaining period, that is called as vote on account, which is being voted in parliament.
Does vote on account have a constitutional basis?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Huh?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Interim budget, does it have a constitutional basis?
No.
No. This question has been asked in prelims. I think it was 2013 or 14, but time हो गया है. लेकिन दोबारा पूछेंगे कि नहीं पूछेंगे, लेकिन हमको तो पता कर सकते हैं तो पता कर लेते हैं. Vote on account versus interim budget. Interim budget क्या हो? Full fledged budget, interim budget, vote on account. Full fledged is government is presenting the entire document, all policies, its new steps that it's going to take for the year to come. It may announce some changes in taxes, it may continue the same taxes, it may announce some new schemes, some new areas of focus, anything. It may announce those things. Budget becomes a document where government makes huge announcements with respect to where it is going to spend money or collect money from. That is a full-fledged budget versus an interim budget. Now, there is no such formal term called as interim budget. It is more of a practice. In the election year, because the government should not present a budget which pertains to the entire year, it should not announce some new schemes or some changes in tax slabs. The government still, because it has to present a budget, the government still presents a budget that is called as an interim budget. As far as it is concerned, an interim budget may continue for the entire year. कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है उसके अंदर. नाम में interim है, लेकिन वो interim budget पूरे साल का budget भी हो सकता है. Because does the constitution require anything with respect to policy announcements? Constitution simply requires, Article 102 requires that the government simply present a statement of expenses and receipts, which are divided on a revenue account and capital account. And as long as the government does that, it presents the annual financial statement, there is nothing that is unconstitutional that is happening. But because of convention, government should not be presenting a full-fledged budget in an election year. Hence, government normally refrains from making any big bang announcements in an interim budget. So an interim budget is different from a full-fledged budget only in the extent. Extent as in not the extent for 2 months or 4 months. Difference because in an interim budget, government generally refrains from such announcements. That is what an interim budget is. Versus vote on account. Now vote on account is constitutional. Vote on account जरूरी नहीं कि केवल election year में present होगा. In fact, vote on account तो हर साल present किया जा सकता है. Vote on account, Article 116. What does Article 116 read? It says that pending the authorization of the required bills by Parliament. Government presents that appropriation bill, finance bill, all these different bills. अब ये polity वाला aspect है, please read it yourself. Government presents authorization by the Parliament for appropriation. Government says we have to appropriate, meaning withdraw some money from CFI. And therefore you, the Parliament, please authorize us to withdraw that money. Parliament will authorize the government only after proper discussion on all those provisions. But maybe the discussion does not take place in time. Maybe the voting does not happen in time. Therefore, pending all that voting, government immediately would want Parliament to authorize some expenses. Meaning, for a part of financial year, government will seek a vote on account. In financial year के पूरे financial year का versus part of financial year का. Government seeks a vote on account that simply allow us to withdraw money for some time period. So a vote on account particularly pertains to a part of FY versus a interim budget. It generally is expected to pertain to part of FY, but it can be for the entire year. Difference आ रहा है सब में सबको? Vote on account versus interim budget and a full-fledged budget. Vote on account is a constitutional term, as in Article 116. This question has been asked in the exam, that is in prelims. I'm sure now you understand, you'll be able to mark the correct answer now. A vote on account is only and only seeking authorization from the parliament to spend money. Versus AFS में क्या है? Annual financial statement में क्या है? It is a estimate of expenses and receipts. Versus vote on account के अंदर क्या है? It is a authorization sought from the parliament to spend some money. Difference समझ में आ रहा है ना सबको? Government presents to the parliament that we expect that we are going to collect these much taxes. This will be our tax slab for future. This is the scheme on which we are going to spend money. It presents all its proposals, its estimates for the coming year. That is a budget or an interim budget if the extent is less. Versus vote on account, government asks the parliament that in next 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, we may have to spend this much money. So before you people vote on anything, discuss on anything, at least इसके ऊपर vote कर दो कि अगले 2-3 महीने तक हमको कोई problem ना हो पैसा खर्च करने के, because we have to withdraw money to spend. Therefore, please give us authorization to spend this money. That is what vote on account is. Vote on account pertains only to expenses for a part of financial year. Versus interim budget pertains to both expense side and receipt side. Tax side, expenditure side, and that may well continue for the entire year as well. तो ये main difference है, ठीक है? Okay. अभी के लिए obviously the numbers not important. More important is this table, as in all the components of budget. Annual, अरे लिखो नहीं यार, लिखो नहीं. ये slides भी तुमको मिल जाएंगी, ठीक है? इधर सुनो, देखो. Annual financial statement, estimate of expenses and receipts, where expenses are required to be separated on revenue account and other account. The practice that has developed is one, other means capital. Therefore, we separate expenses on revenue account and capital account. And second, it is not just receipts, it is not just expenses, but also receipts also that are separated on capital account and revenue account. So when you look at the budget, you will come across numbers like this. Revenue receipts of the government. नहीं दिख रहा है, मैं पढ़ के सुना रहा हूँ. Revenue receipts of the government, you have got tax revenue, non-tax revenue, capital receipts, recovery of loan, other receipts, borrowing and other liabilities. Capital receipts क्या बताएं क्या होती हैं? देखो अब सुनने से ज़्यादा दिमाग लगाने का टाइम आ गया है. अब हम specifically budget के document discuss कर रहे हैं. What is that the reason why you are here? So now कहानी का टाइम खत्म, अब application का टाइम चालू. How did I explain that what are capital receipts? What goes into capital account? Anything that affects assets and liabilities. All right. Capital receipts. What goes into capital receipts? And nahi or. Any money received by the government, receipt. Any money received by the government which is on account of an increase in government's liabilities. Government borrows money, it receives money. Or on account of reduction of government's assets. सरकार का asset कम हो रहा है या सरकार की liability बढ़ रही है. उनको हमने क्या नाम दिया? Capital receipts. Government of India lends money to Government of UP. Government of India is spending money or receiving money? Spending money. What kind of expenditure is this? Asset creating or liability reducing? Asset creating. Why? Because Government of India lends money, तो loan दिया है, तो loan बन गया सरकार का capital expenditure, asset create हो गया है. UP government repays that money to central government. What is happening to value of center's assets? UP पहले सेंटर ने यूपी को लोन दिया था, वो तो एक्सपेंडिचर वो लास्ट ईयर दिया था मान लेते हैं, लास्ट ईयर, एंड दिस ईयर यूपी गवर्नमेंट रीपेज सम पार्ट ऑफ दैट लोन. Modi ji lent 100 crore rupees to Yogi ji. Yogi ji has returned back principal amount, returned back 20 crore rupees this year. Central government receives money or not? Receipt हो गई. अब what kind of receipt would this be? Capital receipt or revenue receipt? Value of central government's asset, दिमाग लगाओ अब, was 100 crore rupees earlier because it has lent 100 crore rupees. Now because UP government has repaid 20 CR, that means what has happened to value of central government's asset? Reduced to 80 crore rupees. मेरे लोन की वैल्यू, मैंने आपको लोन दे रखा था, लोन की वैल्यू was 100 CR, लोन की वैल्यू has reduced to 80 CR because the borrower has repaid the principal amount. That means I have received money 20 CR, but my assets have reduced in value. Is it affecting my asset or not? Asset reducing. I am receiving money or not? Receiving money. Central government is receiving money, but on account of reduction of its asset. It is capital receipt. Recovery of loan. Capital receipt बन गया कि नहीं बन गया? Central government recovers loans, had lent out money and is recovering that money. Becomes a capital receipt. ये पूछे हुए सवाल हैं एग्जाम में, और हर साल ये पूछा हुआ सवाल है. जो वो ये फिलर क्वेश्चंस होते हैं, जो 5-10 सवाल बचते हैं ना लास्ट में, 90 क्वेश्चंस बना लिए हैं, उसके बाद 2-3 सवाल इधर उधर के जो होते हैं. सो दे मेक वन क्वेश्चन नेसेसरली ऑन दिस पार्ट, विच ऑफ द फॉलोइंग इज कैपिटल रिसीट, रेवेन्यू रिसीट, नॉन टाइप, इस टाइप से सवाल बनाते हैं. सो रिकवरी ऑफ लोन बिकम्स व्हाट काइंड ऑफ रिसीट? कैपिटल रिसीट, राइट? Other receipts, this is basically disinvestment receipt. Government of India sells some ownership in ONGC. ONGC is a central government company. Let's say it is right now owned 100% by central government. Central government sells 10% of ownership in ONGC. Central government sells ownership, meaning it will again receive money or not. But money received on account of reduction of assets. Assets सरकार के reduce हो गए तो हो गई disinvestment receipt. This is basically this other receipt. Borrowing and other liabilities. Government of India borrows money. Liability increases. So liability increasing receipts are obviously capital receipts, right? Total expenditure of the government. Again, revenue expense, capital expense. Revenue expense would be salary expense, pension expense, defense expense. All these are example of revenue expenses. Rental expense, maintenance expense, पानी बिजली का सरकार के जो ऑफिस चल रहे हैं, all those expenses are revenue expenses. Capital expense, रोड बनाने के ऊपर expense, नई कंपनी बनाने के ऊपर expense. Government of India lends money, capital expense. All these are example of capital expenses. So you'll have total expenses, रेवेन्यू अकाउंट के एक्सपेंस, जिसमें से एक बड़ा इंटरेस्ट एक्सपेंस होगा इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट. अभी इसके ऊपर बात करते हैं. इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट वुड बी वन ऑफ द बिगेस्ट रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंस ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट. देयर विल बी सम ग्रांट्स इन एड फॉर क्रिएशन ऑफ कैपिटल अकाउंट, नहीं एसेट होना चाहिए था यहाँ पे. ग्रांट्स इन एड फॉर क्रिएशन ऑफ कैपिटल एसेट्स टू द स्टेट्स. डज एनीबडी नो व्हाई इज दिस हेड गिवन अ स्पेशल ट्रीटमेंट हियर? सवाल सुन लो फिर उसका उत्तर देना. सवाल ये है, हम टोटल एक्सपेंडिचर की बात कर रहे हैं. टोटल एक्सपेंडिचर में हमने देखा पहले वन इज रेवेन्यू अकाउंट, रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंसेस ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट. एग्जाम्पल सैलरी, पेंशन, ऑल दीज थिंग्स. एंड विद इन रेवेन्यू हमने दो चीजों को स्पेशल ट्रीटमेंट दी है. वन, वी आर सेइंग रेवेन्यू अकाउंट आउट ऑफ विच वन इज इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट. Why a special treatment to interest? Because interest is the largest component of government expenses. That is why interest payment. And out of revenue, one more thing here, grants in aid for creation of capital assets to states. Why a special treatment to this particular term? हाँ हाँ बोलो, चलो. इफेक्टिव रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट बात करते हैं, अभी ईआरडी के बारे में बात करेंगे. तो देखो ये सवाल बनते हैं फिर यहाँ से. आप फोकस्ड हो इन नंबर्स के ऊपर कि नंबर क्या है, सरकार ने कितना खर्चा किया है. ये टेबल, ये दीज हेड्स आर दी मोर इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग्स फॉर एग्जाम, राइट? सो विल टॉक अबाउट ईआरडी, व्हाट ईआरडी इज इन अ मोमेंट. बट यस, दिस थिंग ग्रांट्स इन एड फॉर क्रिएशन ऑफ कैपिटल एसेट, दिस इज फॉर ईआरडी. इफेक्टिव रेवेन्यू क्या होता है अभी 2 मिनट में बात करने वाले हैं. कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर, इफेक्टिव कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर एक नई टर्म है. Government spends money capital expenditure, which leads to creation of assets or reduction of liability, capital expenditure. And there is something called as effective capital expenditure. Now, what is this new thing? नहीं, effective capital expenditure क्या है? That देख लो, formula पता चल जाएगा. 12 plus 13, this plus this. Government spends money, capital account, asset creating, liability reducing. Add to that, grants in aid for states for creation of capital assets. That becomes effective capital expenditure. अभी देखो, अभी 5 मिनट बाद इसी चीज को दोबारा से समझेंगे क्या चीज है. But for the time being, try to understand what should be your approach towards reading these documents. We'll discuss these deficits in a second. Let's first look at government's receipts. एक एक करके सारे numbers देखेंगे. These are the numbers that we are going to be concerned about. जो भी यहाँ पे देख रहे थे टेबल में. अब हम इन numbers को देखेंगे with respect to this particular budget. What are major receipts of the government? Now these are total receipts of the government. सरकार के total receipt. अब visualize करो यहाँ पे. Rather than numbers, look at the pie chart and try to understand which is the biggest component of government's receipt. ये कौन सा कलर बोलेंगे इसे? जो भी है, let it be X. ये ऑरेंज तो क्योंकि वो ब्राउन, ये ऑरेंज मान लेते हैं. पिंकिश ऑरेंज, पिंक, पीच. चलो, this I'm sure you can see this is the biggest component here, right? What is this component? Borrowings and the liabilities. Now you understand the nature of question that may be asked. Which of the following is the biggest source of receipt for the government? सरकार के टोटल जो सरकार के पास पैसा है उसमें सबसे बड़ा component क्या है? Borrowing. Will help you to write answer in mains as well. You have to assess government's finances. The question is about discuss the sustainability of government of India's debt. Whether the government of India's debt is sustainable or not, meaning is it something that government can repay without reducing some major expenses. Sustainable का मतलब यही होगा ना कि आपकी borrowing की क्षमता, how much is what is your capability to borrow. Capability to borrow depends upon your capability to repay. Can you repay the debt that you are incurring or not? And how will you assess that sustainability? Only when you know, only when you understand that out of the total money that government has for spending, the biggest money comes from borrowing that money, not from some other source, from taxes. As in rightful receipts कम है और borrowed receipt ज़्यादा है. अब समझ में आ रहा है कि क्यों interest expense सबसे ज़्यादा expense होगा. Interest is the biggest expenditure of government. Total interest expense, अभी हम expenses में आएंगे. Interest expenses around 10 lakh crore rupees. नंबर नहीं याद करना है, बस just magnitude तुमको realize करवा रहा हूँ. Total interest expenses around 10 lakh crore rupees. Out of government of India's total expenses, all expenses of around 47 lakh crore rupees. तो 47 में से 10 केवल interest expense है, मतलब 20%. अगर 50 में से 10 होता तो 20% होता. 20% हमारा केवल और केवल इंटरेस्ट के ऊपर खर्चा चला जाता है. तो अब डेट सस्टेनेबिलिटी इवैल्यूएट कर पाओगे इस चीज में. प्रीलिम्स का सवाल बन सकता है, अरेंज द फॉलोइंग एक्सपेंसेस इन ऑर्डर ऑफ मैग्नीट्यूड, अरेंज द फॉलोइंग सोर्सेज इन ऑर्डर ऑफ मैग्नीट्यूड. ये पूछा हुआ सवाल भी है. अरेंज द फॉलोइंग टैक्सेस इन ऑर्डर ऑफ मैग्नीट्यूड. यू सी द बिगेस्ट सोर्सेज, व्हिच टैक्स? कॉर्पोरेशन टैक्स इज द बिगेस्ट सोर्स. कॉर्पोरेशन टैक्स, जीएसटी, income tax, corporate tax, excise duty. Which are the biggest amongst all? इसीलिए जब सवाल देखोगे ना एग्जाम में तो आंख पूरी तरह खोल के देखना सवाल. ये नहीं कि जो है जो दिमाग में है उसी को तुरंत अप्लाई कर दिया. I use the word GST. I did not say CGST. When I say GST, GST is central plus state GST. यहाँ पे क्या लिखा होगा? यहाँ पे लिखा this is central component of GST. यहाँ पे sorry यहाँ पे लिखा तो GST ही है, but yes this is central component. This is not total GST. This is central component. ये सरकार की वेबसाइट से उठाया मैंने. गलत इसमें कुछ नहीं है, but yes because it is central government document, it is central GST. Don't, there's nothing wrong there. GST which is CGST plus SGST, that is the biggest component. Around 50-50 GST and SGST तो लगभग आधा हो जाता है, वो CGST बच जाता है. When you look at total taxes of the government, corporation is biggest, then CGST, then income tax, then excise, customs, ये सब order आ जाता है. तो अब ये 2-3 बार सवाल पूछा गया है. Arrange the following taxes in order of magnitude. I think last year भी पूछा, 2022 में पूछा गया था सवाल. और ये वो फिलर क्वेश्चन जो होते हैं ना, बड़ा कॉमन सवाल है ये वाला. Arrange the following taxes in order of their magnitude. GST अगर है, that means it is total GST, CGST plus SGST. लेकिन अगर वहाँ पे specifically लिखा है CGST, that means it is only going to come a central component. So this is what you should be looking at in this chart. That one, that our biggest source of money is borrowing. The amount of borrowing that we do is more than amount of taxes that we collect. As in amount of, individually speaking, any tax that we collect, it collectively करोगे तो obviously ज़्यादा हो जाएगा. Amount of borrowing that we do is more than any other particular source of receipt for the government. Borrowing is the biggest source of receipt for the government. And amongst its non-borrowing sources, non-debt receipts, we have GST, corporate tax, then the half component CGST, then income tax, excise, customs, etc. ये हमारा फिर उसके बाद order आ जाता है. These are sources of our receipts. Common question in exam regarding trends of receipt. Now these statements would be there as part of, ये जो अभी बताऊं किस टाइप का सवाल पूछा जाता है, पूछा गया है, पूछा जाएगा. Normally you will see these questions as part of two statements. Statement 1, which would normally be a fact, and statement 2, which would be some conceptual statement. India's tax to GDP ratio has been consistently rising during last decade. Factual statement. A country with low tax to GDP ratio is expected to have more inequality. Conceptual and some opinion-based statement. सवाल आ रहा है समझ में? So you'll have then statement 1 and 2 is correct. तो अब जब आपको पहली statement ही नहीं पता, fact वाली statement, तो फिर दूसरी वाली को concept करके क्या कर लोगे आप? So second one is subjective in nature, meaning you have to derive that whether countries with low tax to GDP ratio will have more inequality or less inequality. Chances are low tax to GDP ratio would mean that countries have more inequality. Chances are. Versus first statement becomes a factual statement. So for that, you'll have to look at these diagrams then. So these diagrams, these trends, these are important trends. Our tax to GDP ratio has not been consistently rising. It is almost the same in last 30-35 years. It has been around total, center state की total मिला के, has been around 15 to 17% in last 35 years. जिसमें से सेंटर की अराउंड 10 to 11% रहती है और स्टेट की अराउंड 5 to 6% रहती है. Our tax to GDP ratio has not increased by any significant amount in last 10 years. 10% थी यहाँ पे, बढ़ के 11.2, कम होके 10.2, बढ़ के 11.7. It has been within this range. You can look at this graph. It's not showing some consistent increase over a period. It is usually within a very tight range only. Clear है? Government's tax receipts, उनका trend क्या है? Then they would ask that within government's tax receipts, what is the share of our direct tax receipts and indirect tax receipts? The statement would be कि हमारे direct tax ज़्यादा हैं, indirect taxes कम हैं. क्या मतलब factual पूछा जाएगा? Generally, it is seen that direct taxes are more as compared to indirect taxes. Then they will ask a question trend के ऊपर that direct taxes as a proportion of total taxes have been consistently increasing. सवाल सुन लो ध्यान से. Direct taxes as a proportion of total taxes have been consistently increasing. अब ये green bar and this yellow bar. Yellow bar is direct tax, green bar is indirect tax. Have direct taxes as a proportion of total tax, have they been consistently increasing? Yellow bar की width as a proportion of total bar. क्या consistently increase कर रहा है? It's not been increasing consistently. It is almost in the same. Around 50-50 division रहा है हमेशा हमारा. Around 55% के आसपास we have our direct taxes, around 45% we have indirect taxes. That has been the case. Sometimes it might be 50 से कम होकर 53 हो जाते हैं और वो 45 से बढ़ के 48-47 हो जाते हैं. Sometimes from 55 they increase to 58 and they reduce to 42. But yes, broadly they have been in this similar range, 45 to 55%. 45% indirect taxes, 55% direct taxes. Normally this has been the range. Now from this they will ask this question that कि बताओ consistently बढ़ रहा है या नहीं हो रहा है. And then second statement would be direct taxes are progressive in nature and indirect taxes are regressive in nature. इसका तो उत्तर दे सकते हो. True or false? Direct taxes are progressive in nature and indirect taxes are regressive in nature. True or false? ऐसे मत करो. प्रोग्रेसिव का मतलब क्या होगा? हाँ, जिसको उत्तर पता है वो बताओ. प्रोग्रेसिव का मतलब क्या होगा? प्रोग्रेसिव टैक्सेस किसको बोलते हैं? विच इज कंसिस्टेंटली इंक्रीजिंग. नो, बोलो. इनकम के प्रोपोर्शन में लगता है. प्रोपोर्शन तो फिर प्रोपोर्शनेट हो जाएगा ना.
हेलो सर, व्हेन इनकम स्लैब इंक्रीजेस.
कौन बोल रहा है, कहां से? हाँ, यस.
सर, व्हेन इनकम स्लैब इंक्रीजेस द टैक्स इंक्रीजेस, देन इट इज प्रोग्रेसिव टैक्सेशन.
Basically, the idea is the rich pay more proportion of their income as tax. That is the idea. Progressive. Regressive, the rich pay less proportion of their income as tax. वो हो गया progressive and regressive. ठीक है? Indirect tax, generally speaking, progressive consider किए जाते हैं, regressive consider किए जाते हैं. Because everybody pays same amount of indirect tax on a particular good. पार्ले जी मैं खरीदूं, आप खरीदो, अंबानी जी खरीदे, सबको same rate of tax पे करना है. That means as a proportion of income, अंबानी जी will be paying much less rate of tax. Proportion of income को अगर देखा जाए तो. Therefore, generally speaking, we consider indirect taxes regressive taxes versus progressive. Direct taxes are generally progressive in nature. Why? Because when your incomes increase, you pay more proportion of your income as tax. तो अब one statement would be of this nature. सवाल आया समझ में क्या है? इस टाइप के सवाल पूछे जाएंगे एग्जाम में. That our proportion of direct and indirect taxes have been consistently increasing, and statement 2, direct taxes are generally progressive or regressive, whatever in nature. इस टाइप से सवाल पूछा जाएगा. आप अब समझ में आ रहा है क्या चीज याद नहीं करनी है, कहां पे नहीं फंसना है. डोंट लुक एट दीज नंबर्स कि भैया 4.9 है, 6.7 है, इतना है. लुक एट दीज ट्रेंड्स एंड देन ट्राई टू ascertain something that you can think about these, as in what can you conclude from these trends. What can you look at this number and then what can you conclude? This is what you should be looking at when you look at these numbers, right? Total receipts of center. The total receipt. अब this is not percentage term में receipt. This is total receipt of center. ये सवाल भी पूछा गया है और पूछा आगे भी जा सकता है. You have to be careful about. Please read the statement carefully. That whether the question is asking कि total receipt बढ़ी है या total receipt as a percentage of GDP बढ़ी है. Carefully देखना. Our tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, जो मैंने अभी बोला था, has been around 15 to 17%. Taxes as a proportion of GDP have not increased, have not shown some increasing trend. But obviously, total taxes that we collect, वो तो increase हो ही रहे हैं ना. GDP is increasing and we are collecting, even though we are collecting the same proportion of GDP as taxes, तो amount of tax तो बढ़ेगा ही बढ़ेगा. So read the question statement carefully, right? So total taxes that we collect, obviously they have been increasing. Trends in our receipts, right? This year we are expected to collect, as every year we are expected to collect much more amount of taxes. अब यहाँ पे क्या देखोगे? ये बार देख रहे हो बीच में? This is an aberration or not? Normally you see an increasing trend, but you see a decline here and then again an increasing trend. Which is this year? COVID year. So nature of question would be, our total tax receipts has shown a consistent increase over every year since last 5 years. समझ में आ गया? समझ में आया नेचर ऑफ क्वेश्चन किस तरीके से देखना है? लास्ट 5 साल तो 5 साल का है अभी कोविड को यार, 2020 का है. Has consistently seen an increase since last 5 years. No, in 2020 it declined, right? So this, please keep a keen eye on the nature of question. कि question में क्या पूछा गया है, ये यहाँ से ये चीज़ पूछी जाएगी. So when you look at these things, when you're looking at these things, think of it like this. Look at the trends here, right? This is about our non-debt receipts. Some facts that our finance minister said regarding taxes. Our direct taxes, again पूछे जा सकते हैं एग्जाम में. Our direct taxes even though as a proportion of GDP, they are on the same side, as in we were collecting around 5% of GDP as taxes, direct taxes, we are still collecting around 5.5% cash plus, but the total number of taxpayers, income taxpayers, they have increased by around 2.3 times in last 7-8 years. So this has increased. Direct tax collection has increased by this much. Improvement in ease of tax payment, we have got certain steps that we took. For example, reduction of tax rates, introduction of new forms. जैसे एक form है form 26 AS. Nirmala ji use this form in her speech. Form 26 AS के अंदर क्या होता है? I earn income from Vision IAS. The income that I earn, tax is paid on that income. Tax is paid, how much amount of tax has been paid. All of that gets recorded and automatically populated in that particular form. Both are form 26 AS. I also have my bank account in which I have deposits. I earn interest on my deposit. That is also my income. उसके ऊपर भी tax pay करना है. When my bank pays interest to me, my income, my bank also deducts a tax on that income. That means that information also gets automatically known to the government under Form 26 AS, as in I get to know it, government gets to know it. I also have investments in multiple shares, and those shares pay dividend to me, and when they pay dividend, that is again part of my income. Therefore, again, when I earn those dividends, the company will deduct the tax and deposit the tax with the government. Any kind of tax that I have paid to the government or anybody else on my behalf has paid to the government, वो सारी tax information Form 26 AS में आती है. Income tax returns. Anybody earns an income from any source. I earn income in form of salary, in form of interest on my deposits, in form of some shares that I purchase, dividend on those incomes. I sell some shares at a higher price. I have some capital gains. That is also my income. I have some house. I earn rent on that house. That is also my income. As an individual, I will have multiple sources of income. You will have multiple sources of income. जो भी आपकी income है, आपको उस income के ऊपर tax pay करना है. In some cases, you will yourself be paying taxes. In other cases, when somebody pays an income to you, that person is responsible to deduct the tax and then pay the tax adjusted income to you. इसको बोलते हैं TDS, tax deducted at source. I get a salary of 1 lakh rupees from Vision. Let's say Vision IAS has to deduct a 10% tax on that. So therefore, I will get 90,000 rupees in my account and 10,000 rupees will be automatically deposited with the government as part of my taxes. तो Vision IAS मेरे को पैसा देने से पहले automatically deduct करके उसके सरकार को जमा कर देगा. All that record is where it's in Form 26 AS. What does that help in? That helps in ease of assessment or not. Now the government knows, now the individual knows how much income I earned, and therefore how much tax am I supposed to pay, or the government how much tax we are supposed to collect from this person. This is ease of earning, ease of paying taxes. So we have been doing these things. A new form has been introduced, and because of that, you can see number of taxpayers has been increasing, tax collection has been increasing, and most importantly, disputes between government and taxpayers have been falling. केवल एक ही चीज सरकार ने अनाउंस करी है टैक्सेस के रिलेटेड इस बार, which is with respect to some disputes that government had with taxpayers. मेरी इनकम इस साल 1 करोड़ रुपए हुई, on which I have to pay 10 lakh rupees tax to the government. But I declare to the government that my income is, because let's say I claim some deduction, some expenses, I declare to the government that my income is not 1 crore rupees, it is only 80 lakh rupees. Hence, मेरे को मान लेते हैं मेरे को 8 लाख रुपए टैक्स पे करना है. Government thinks that I have to pay 10 lakh rupees of tax, versus I claim that I have to pay only 8 lakh rupees of tax. So there is a dispute between me and government or not? The tax department, जब आप IRS ऑफिसर बनोगे तब आप फिर मेरे को जो है tax notice भेजोगे that we believe that you have to pay more tax versus you have paid less amount of tax. Tax dispute. What will happen to these tax disputes? They will linger on for many years. They will be on government books for many years. Application exchange होती रहेगी. You might be, let's say, extracting some bribe from me, or I might be willingly giving some bribe to you. There will be litigation costs involved in this case. So government said this year that we are going to forego many of such tax disputes. जो पुराने टैक्स डिस्प्यूट्स हैं 1962 से चलते आ रहे हैं. 1961 की इनकम टैक्स एक्ट है, आईटी एक्ट 1961, एंड 1962 जो पहला साल था वहां से लेके अब तक हमारे डिस्प्यूट अभी भी जिंदा है. सो अप टू 2010 हमने काफी सारे टैक्स डिस्प्यूट जो थे उनको वी सेड दैट ओके माफ किया इनको, एज इन नॉट ऑल बट यस अप टू अ सर्टेन अमाउंट. And from 2010 to 2015, some more disputes have been simply said that we are not going to raise any tax demands with these people. Ease of payment of taxes, right? Tax assessment ki ease karna. This is an important step with respect to collection of taxes by the government. And this is why we see that there has been improvement in tax collection by the government. ठीक है, ये एक important step है. Indirect taxes, again one more important fact here regarding tax buoyancy. बताओ भी किसको पता टैक्स बायंसी? आई विल कम टू योर क्वेश्चन जस्ट अ सेकंड. ये कंप्लीट कर लो फिर आप बताओ. एक सेकंड किसको, कौन बोल रहा है? टैक्स बायंसी बोलो. हाँ,
रेवेन्यू अपॉन जीडीपी. इट इज एन इंडिकेटर.
एक मिनट यार, एक मिनट, एक करके बोलो.
रेवेन्यू अपॉन जीडीपी.
विच रेवेन्यू अपॉन
टैक्स?
आई विल नॉट गिव इट टू यू. 50% सही है, नॉट कंप्लीटली करेक्ट. पीछे बोलो.
सर इट इज एन इंडिकेटर व्हिच इज यूज्ड टू फाइंड व्हेन द
कहाँ से यार? हाँ,
सर
yes.
टैक्स रिसीप्ट का दैट इज received by the government divided by the total GDP of the state.
No, अभी तो इसने ही बोला था. हाँ बस बोलो. yes बोल दो यार. एक सेकंड.
Increase in taxes respect to GDP.
Increase in taxes with respect to GDP. Tax growth upon GDP growth. That is what tax buoyancy is. Your GDP is growing by some number. Economic activity, बात नहीं करो. Economic activity grows by some number. अब ये देखो यार, ये चीजें पूछी हुई सवाल हैं एग्जाम में. Probably in my view टैक्स बायंसी के ऊपर, अब ये मैं तुमको नहीं बताऊंगा, ये तुम्हारी खुद की जिम्मेदारी है देखना. टैक्स बायंसी के ऊपर सवाल पूछा गया था 2017 में, which in my view probably is the most difficult question asked in prelims till date. As in there is no correct answer to that question even that anybody knows. टैक्स बायंसी के ऊपर सवाल था. सुन लो कॉन्सेप्ट क्या है. कॉन्सेप्ट तो कम से कम, अब वो मुश्किल सवाल दोबारा नहीं पूछा जाए तो कोई बात नहीं, लेकिन आसान तो पूछा जा ही सकता है, वो पूछा भी जाता है. टैक्स बायंसी means how buoyant are your taxes, meaning your economy is growing. Are your taxes growing at the same pace or not? Economy is growing at the rate of 10%. More economic activity, economy grows by 10%. Do you collect 10% more taxes as compared to last year or not? अगर आप 10% एक्स्ट्रा कलेक्ट कर रहे हो तो हम बोलेंगे कि यूनिट बायंसी है. 10% tax growth upon 10% economic growth. If you collect 12% taxes given 10% economic growth, that means your taxes are more buoyant. It is 1.2. 12% upon 10% becomes 1.2. तो आपकी टैक्स बायंसी कितनी हो गई? 1.2 की हो गई. So would a country desire taxes be buoyant, more buoyant or less buoyant? क्या डिजायर है बोलोगा? टैक्स बायंसी ज्यादा होनी चाहिए, कम होनी चाहिए? ज्यादा होनी चाहिए. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, टैक्सेस डिपेंड अपॉन डिग्री ऑफ फॉर्मलाइजेशन ऑफ द इकोनॉमी और नॉट. इकोनॉमी कितनी फॉर्मल इन नेचर है? Economy is more formal, meaning more people are recognized as taxpayers, hence chances are they will be paying those taxes. Economy is growing, लेकिन growth के साथ साथ economy की formalization नहीं बढ़ रही है. अगर नहीं बढ़ेगी formalization तो economy भले ही grow करेगी, government के taxes grow नहीं कर पाएंगे. लेकिन if economy is growing and simultaneously economy is also formalizing, then because economy becomes formal, therefore chances are government taxes will now rise at a greater pace. इसी के टाइप का सवाल पूछा गया था एक, formalization and tax buoyancy के ऊपर. So formalization is an important factor determining government's tax buoyancy. समझ में आ रहा है क्या है tax buoyancy? Indirect taxes की क्या buoyancy है? Pre-GST, post-GST. Now this question has been asked in mains, not in prelims. Mains का सवाल है, ये जो लिखा है ना, tax buoyancy of state government's revenue. ये mains का सवाल है, पूछा हुआ सवाल है. Pre-GST, post-GST. UP government has some tax revenue. Pre-GST की बात करें, मान लेते 2014, 15, 16 की बात कर रहे हैं. UP government is collecting some taxes. In 2014, it was collecting 100 rupees of tax. In 15, it collects 105 rupees of tax. In 16, it collects 112 rupees of tax. So there is some growth in taxes. Versus UP's GDP would also be growing at some pace. Indian economy is growing at 10%. Let's say UP slow growth state, UP is growing at 8%. So GDP growth of UP and tax growth of UP government. What proportion what is the relationship between tax growth of UP government's growth in tax of UP government to that of UP's GDP? तो ये क्या हो गई हमारी tax buoyancy हो गई कि नहीं? Tax buoyancy. Pre-GST tax buoyancy of state revenue was 0.77, meaning states GDP was growing, but their revenues were not growing at the pace. Taxes were non-buoyant, not buoyant. GDP grew by a faster pace, but state government's tax revenues did not grow. Post GST, we have got greater buoyancy. Ab buoyancy is 1.22, meaning taxes are growing at a faster pace as compared to growth of state's economy. More buoyancy is desirable or not? That means states now have, relatively speaking, more money with them as compared to what they would have had we not switched over to GST. Question in paper 2 and paper 3. Paper 3 का सवाल था, paper 2 का सवाल था regarding discussion of GST as a more efficient way of tax collection. वहाँ पे सवाल basically was with respect to fiscal federalism. ये paper 2 का सवाल है. Versus paper 3 का सवाल था, which is I think 2021 or 2020. Paper 3 का सवाल था with respect to analysis of GST as a more efficient way of tax collection. So post GST, our tax buoyancy, especially for states, has increased, and we can see it is 1.22. That means GST has resulted in, had GST not been there, state का revenue बढ़ता, लेकिन तब इतने पैसे नहीं बढ़ता जितना GST के बाद बढ़ रहा है. So more buoyant collection of indirect taxes also post GST, right? So this is with respect to taxes. बोलो क्या सवाल था? माइक ले लो. हमारा रेवेन्यू वाला पार्ट यहाँ पे खत्म होता है. अब हम एक्सपेंडिचर देखेंगे. एक्सपेंडिचर के बाद वी लुक एट सम मेजर एरियाज ऑफ फोकस, जैसे बजट में कुछ अनाउंसमेंट्स की गई हैं. एंड देन फाइनली वी लुक एट डेट सस्टेनेबिलिटी, राइट? वी लुक एट गवर्नमेंट्स डेट एंड डेफिसिट. बोलो
सर, कैन यू प्लीज एक्सप्लेन हाउ as you have said, how high debt to GDP ratio will increase inequality, because it's very confusing since all the major economies like Japan and US have such high ratio and
so what is the level of inequality in US?
Yes, sir. It can't be calculated, but
so this is more intuitive in nature. लेकिन हाँ, अच्छी बात है तुमने सवाल पूछा. His question is, he wants an explanation on how does debt to GDP ratio relate to inequality in a country? Without numbers, we'll try to think of it intuitively only. ठीक है, numbers के साथ नहीं. A country having high debt to GDP ratio versus country having low debt to GDP ratio. नहीं, मैंने debt नहीं बोला था, मैंने tax बोला था यार. Tax बोला था मैंने. Tax to GDP ratio. When the tax to GDP ratio is low, that means chances are only few people are paying taxes. That means most of the economy is not even eligible to pay taxes or is evading paying taxes. How many people in the country pay taxes? हमारे country में around 7 crore individuals pay taxes, which is in fact अभी लिखा था ना 2.3 times increase over 2015-16. तो 2015-16 में हमारे यहाँ लगभग 2-2.25 करोड़ इंडिविजुअल टैक्स पे कर रहे थे. If you earn 10 lakh rupees of income in India today, आपको क्या लगता है कि अगर आप 10 लाख रुपए इनकम कमाते हो, मतलब which is around 55,000 rupees per month, तो आप गेस करो रैंडम गेस, तो आप गेस करो कि आप कंट्री के किस ब्रैकेट में आते होगे. टॉप 1%, 2%, 5, 10, 15, किस ब्रैकेट में आते होगे? टेक अ गेस.
सर, to become in top 10% you have to earn 25,000 per year. ऐसा है कुछ डेटा. तो मतलब
आप 10 लाख रुपए पर साल कमाते हो, मतलब अराउंड 55,000 रुपीज पर मंथ कमाते हो, तो आप गेस करो कि आप किस ब्रैकेट में आते होगे. हाँ, 0.1%. You are in 0.1%. Feel good. Chances are all of you are from the same families, from the families who earn more than 10 lakh. सब लोग 2-2 लाख रुपए देके बैठे हुए हो, ठीक है? तो chances are all of you are in the top 0.1% bracket. Do you think you are in top 0.1%? No, you don't think you are in top 1%. This is what inequality is. बात मत करो भाई, बाद में डिसाइड कर लेना कौन कितना टैक्स पे करता है. A country with low tax to GDP ratio would mean that chances are there are very less individuals who pay taxes, and therefore one, entire burden of taxes is upon them only, and second, what it means is most population is ineligible to pay taxes. That means most population does not even earn to that threshold where you are required to pay some taxes, जो कि threshold already बहुत कम होता है. Hence, in a country with low tax to GDP ratio, chances are inequality would be high. There, in fact, अब observation, when we look at countries with lesser inequality as compared to others, we see कि normally वहाँ पे tax to GDP ratio ज़्यादा होती है. अगर हम जापान को देखें, जर्मनी को देखें, स्वीडन, डेनमार्क, इन कंट्रीज को देखें, where if you remove the extremes, meaning the richest people, most people are in that middle bracket. And most of them are paying taxes, as a result of which the government's tax collections are normally on the higher side. So tax to GDP ratio is higher, therefore chances are inequality would be low. Okay? Okay, expenses. Again, observe the pie chart and see which is the major expense of the government. Are state's share of taxes? चलो मैं दूसरा चार्ट लगाता हूँ. दिस इज ऑल्सो सही चार्ट, बट यहाँ पे नंबर्स क्योंकि यहाँ पे भी 20 वहाँ पे भी 20 है, तो यू आर नॉट एबल टू. स्टेट्स शेयर ऑफ टैक्सेस कौन सा है? चलो यहीं पे डिस्कस करते हैं. क्या है स्टेट शेयर ऑफ टैक्सेस? हाउ डज सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट स्पेंड? हाउ डज अ सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट स्पेंड द टोटल मनी दैट इट रिसीव्स? Central government receive income tax, corporate tax, GST, CGST part. It receives debt receipts. It has disinvestment receipts. Central government के पास total पैसा बड़े सारे sources से आया. अब सरकार उस पैसे को कैसे खर्च करती है? How does government spend? One, this is how the government spends its money. Second, within this, what does Finance Commission do? Finance Commission divides what? Net proceed of taxes. Finance Commission divides net proceeds of taxes between center and states and then amongst states. Horizontal vertical devolution, right? Net proceed of taxes. So central government ने number one taxes जो collect किए, सेंट्रल जीएसटी, इनकम टैक्स, एक्साइज, कस्टम, ये सब मिला के सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट ने जो टैक्सेस, केवल टैक्स की बात कर रहे हैं, सेंटर कलेक्ट्स टैक्सेस ऑफ लेट्स से 100 रुपीज. आउट ऑफ दैट 100, 10 रुपीज आर स्पेंड इन कलेक्शन ऑफ टैक्सेस. टैक्स कलेक्ट करने में बेसिकली इनकम टैक्स डिपार्टमेंट, जीएसटी डिपार्टमेंट ने कितना खर्चा किया टैक्स कलेक्ट करने के लिए? सो 90 रुपीज इज व्हाट इज द नेट प्रोसीड्स ऑफ टैक्सेस. आउट ऑफ दैट 90, that 90 will be divided between center and state by Finance Commission first. तो Finance Commission ने बोला कि 42% states का और बचा 50% आपका. So 90 में से around 40 rupees is states and 50 rupees is center. तो ये जो state share of taxes है ये है. This is not available with the center to spend. Center collects this money, but part of this money goes to states on which center has no control over. This is Finance Commission transfer. This is state share of taxes and duties. When we talk about ये है सेंटर का टोटल जो पैसा सरकार के पास आया है उसमें से कहाँ कहाँ पैसा जा रहा है. This is where money is going. This is state share of tax. Remaining part is what is available with the center to actually spend. Center is going to spend the remaining money. It doesn't have this money. It collects this money, but this money goes to the states as part of Finance Commission recommendation. So this is not available with the center. Remaining money, this ये जो peach color के सिवा बाकी वाला part है, this is what is available to the center to spend. So within this, which is the biggest component of center expenses? interest payment. All the अब remaining expense की बात कर रहा हूँ. When we look at remaining expense of the center, this is how we look at center's expense. As in apart from finance commission ने जो division किया है उसके सिवा वाला part, broadly divided into two categories: center's expenses and center's transfers. सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट के पास 110 रुपीज मान लेते हैं, सुनो इधर मत देखो, इधर देखो. सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट collected 110 rupees as taxes, out of which 10 rupees were spent for collection of taxes. Remaining is 100, out of which 40 rupees have gone to states for as part of finance commission. Remaining with center is 60 rupees. तो ये तो क्या 60 rupees सेंटर के पास जो टैक्स बचा है. Then center has around 50 rupees of borrowing. सरकार ने 50 रुपए की borrowing करी. Total money available with center कितना हो गया? 60 plus 50, 110 rupees. Then central government has some disinvestment receipts of let's say 10 rupees more. That means 110 plus 10, 120 रुपए. Plus there are some fines, fees, dividends, interest receipts, etc. which are let's say totaling to 20 rupees. Total money available with the center कितना हो गया? 140 rupees. 60 rupees of taxes with center, 50 rupees of borrowing by center, 10 rupees of disinvestment by center, and 20 rupees of other revenue receipt of the center. So 50 plus 60 plus 50, 110 plus 10, 20 plus 20, 40. तो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट के पास टोटल 140 रुपए हैं अब खर्च करने के लिए. सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट ने कलेक्ट किए थे प्लस 40 जो कि स्टेट को दे दिए. इट कलेक्टेड टोटल 180. नाउ इट हैज 140 विद इट टू स्पेंड. Where does that 140 come from? जो हमने ऊपर पाई चार्ट बनाया था. It comes from taxes, it comes from borrowings, it comes from disinvestments, it comes from interest receipts, it comes from some other sources, fines, fees, etc. So central government has 140 rupees to spend. How is it spending that 140 rupees? अब उसको broadly दो पार्ट में डिवाइड किया. One, center's expenditure and second, center's transfers. सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट ने जो खुद के ऊपर खर्चा करना है, सेंटर का अपना एक्सपेंडिचर, सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट्स ओन एक्सपेंसेस, सेंटर्स एक्सपेंसेस एंड सेंटर्स ट्रांसफर, मीनिंग व्हाट इट इज गोइंग टू गिव टू द स्टेट्स. सेंटर्स एक्सपेंसेस, थ्री पार्ट्स हियर. फर्स्ट इज एस्टैब्लिशमेंट एक्सपेंस. एस्टैब्लिशमेंट एक्सपेंस क्या होता है? सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट ने अपने आप के ऊपर जो कोर खर्चा करना है. सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट हैज ऑफिसेज अराउंड द कंट्री, अक्रॉस द वर्ल्ड. Home Ministry expenses, Finance Ministry expenses, Agriculture Ministry, these are all centers establishment expenses. मोदी जी बाहर गए हैं उसका खर्चा, centers establishment expenses. These are centers establishment expenses. Then center has still lot of money left with it. Then comes in central sector schemes. Central sector schemes क्या होती हैं? Central government makes schemes on union list or on concurrent list. These schemes, both. These schemes are owned by a center, implemented by a center, financed by a center. Center will obviously take help of states to implement क्योंकि ultimately होने तो किसी जगह पे implement है ना. It will take help of states to implement those schemes, but entire scheme is a central government scheme. Complete modalities laid down by the center, implemented by the center, but obviously taking help of state government to implement. These are central sector schemes. ठीक है? Then center still has remaining money. It obviously has to pay interest, other expenses. तो ये तीन हो गए center के expenses: interest expense, establishment expense, and central sector scheme expense. These are center's expenses. बचा हुआ जो है वो center of states को transfer करेगा. Transfer अलग अलग form में कर सकता है. One, center transfers money in form of centrally sponsored schemes. Centrally sponsored CSS क्या हुई? State government proposes, central government agrees to finance that scheme partly, but on the basis of conditions laid by the center. Center will say ये conditions हैं इस scheme की, तभी आपको sponsor करेंगे, otherwise sponsor नहीं करने वाले. So central government lays down conditions of that scheme, sponsoring that scheme. States agree to those conditions and hence center sponsors those schemes partly. So central government sponsors those schemes, centrally sponsored scheme CSS. Center ने transfer किया state को पैसा. इसके सिवा center और भी तरीके से transfer कर सकता है. फाइनेंस कमीशन ने क्या रिकमेंड किया था? डिवीजन ऑफ नेट प्रोसीड्स ऑफ टैक्स बिटवीन सेंटर एंड स्टेट. फाइनेंस कमीशन उसके सिवा और भी रिकमेंडेशंस कर सकता है. कौन सा आर्टिकल है? 275, 272, 283. तो 280 वाला डिवीजन है जो सेंटर का नेट प्रोसीड ऑफ टैक्सेस का है. उसके सिवा अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट ऑल्सो, अब देखो पॉलिटी भी बीच में है यहाँ पे, यू मस्ट हैव, अब समझ में आ गया ना? फाइनेंस कमीशन इज गोइंग टू रिकमेंड अदर मनी दैट हैज टू बी गिवन टू स्टेट्स एज वेल. For example, Finance Commission will say कि Uttarakhand is facing lot of disasters. Please give some disaster specific grant to this state. Discretionary grants. It will say that Assam doesn't have enough money to meet even its revenue expenses. It has lot of expenditure requirement, but because there is not enough ability of the state to collect taxes, that means even though we divide some taxes, when we devolve some taxes to the state will still have a huge shortfall of its revenue. Hence, you give some additional grant to this state. So, Finance Commission अब states को कुछ additional grant की भी recommendation देगा center को कि इस state को इस purpose के लिए या किसी और purpose के लिए आप पैसा और grant करो. So, Finance Commission will give some other grants also. तो यहाँ पे क्या है? Finance Commission grants. ये कौन से grant है? ये वो Article 280 वाले grants नहीं है. These are not net proceeds of taxes divided between center and state. These are apart from that. Finance Commission gives a recommendation to the president. Central government will, in most cases, not reject those recommendations कि भाई कितना टैक्स वाला पार्ट ट्रांसफर करना है स्टेट को, डिवॉल्व करना है स्टेट्स को. लेकिन ये वाला पार्ट डिस्क्रेशनरी है, तभी तो नाम है ना डिस्क्रेशनरी ग्रांट्स. ये डिस्क्रेशनरी ग्रांट्स हैं. So Finance Commission grants to states. Central government then spends money, gives that to state. And there are some other grants, loans or transfers. Other मतलब क्या हुआ? हाँ ठीक है, चलो नेचुरल कैलामिटी भी आ जाती है, बट यस मेजर कॉम्पोनेंट यहाँ पे क्या होगा? नीतीश कुमार जी क्या बोलते हैं? स्पेशल स्टेटस. अब स्पेशल स्टेटस तो रहा नहीं, वो तो पहले हुआ करता था, अब तो नहीं है. पॉलिटिकल इशू भले ही हो, लेकिन मतलब मन में जिंदा है. What benefit did a state get when it got special category status? हाँ, ये ऊपर इधर देखो, सेंट्रली स्पॉन्सर्ड स्कीम दिख रही हैं. क्या बताया था सेंट्रली स्पॉन्सर्ड स्कीम के अंदर? सेंट्रल स्पॉन्सर्ड स्कीम के अंदर क्या बताया था? Some sponsoring of state scheme by center. Center says, okay, this is a scheme, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. In this, you have to serve midday meal to students, and this is a centrally sponsored scheme. So what we are going to do is, this scheme requires expenditure of 100 rupees. I will give you 60, you spend 40, and hence the scheme will be sponsored. Center ने बोला हम 60 रुपया देंगे, 40 आप देना, 40 by state, and hence the scheme is going to be sponsored. The state then goes to center and asks, I don't even have 40 to finance my component. जो मेरा component है 40 रुपए का, वो भी मैं finance नहीं कर पाऊंगा. Then center says, okay, I'm going to give you either give you a loan for your 40 rupees or simply a grant for your 40 rupees. तो 40 रुपए जो आपका component है उसमें for example मैं 30 रुपए आपको लोन दे देता हूँ, या फिर 20 रुपए का आपको ग्रांट दे देता हूँ. अब डिफरेंस आ जाएगा ना लोन और ग्रांट में. लोन मतलब वो वापस किया जाएगा, लोन हैज टू बी रिटर्न बैक, ग्रांट डजंट हैव टू बी रिटर्न बैक. स्पेशल कैटेगरी स्टेट्स यूज टू गेट their part of CSS in form of grant, versus non-special category states used to get their part. If a state needed, they would then have got their part of sponsorship, their part of contribution in form of a loan. ये difference था special category और non-special category के अंदर. So this is what this other loans transfers mostly are. Yes, there can be disaster specific grants, there can be some panchayat grants, all these are there. But yes, other grants, mostly these were grants where center is financing the state component of CSS, right? Last part before I take up your questions. Capital expenditure. Asset creating, liability reducing. Now what do we have here? Effective capital expenditure. ये तो हो गया सेंटर का टोटल एक्सपेंडिचर, सेंटर ने इतना पैसा खर्च किया टोटल. नाउ इसमें से कुछ पैसा रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंस होगा, कुछ पैसा कैपिटल एक्सपेंस होगा. सेंटर इज स्पेंडिंग मनी फॉर एमजी नरेगा. एमजी नरेगा कौन सी स्कीम है? सेंट्रल सेक्टर है, सेंट्रली स्पॉन्सर्ड है. CS और CSS. एक ऐसी तो बोलना है तो तुम करके बोल दोगे. हाँ, सेंट्रली स्पॉन्सर्ड स्कीम. MG नरेगा is a centrally sponsored scheme. CSS have two components, core of core schemes and core schemes. MG नरेगा is a core of core scheme. Centrally sponsored scheme है MG नरेगा. So MG नरेगा centrally sponsored scheme. क्या है MG नरेगा के अंदर? What is the objective? 100 days of unskilled manual work. ये ऑब्जेक्टिव नहीं है. Objective of MG नरेगा. Objective is to create durable assets in rural areas. ये ऑब्जेक्टिव है. अरे एक मिनट रुक जाओ, एक मिनट रुक जाओ, बस मैं खत्म कर रहा हूं, फिर तुम्हारे सवाल मैं लूंगा, बस 2 मिनट रुक जाओ. और objective of MG नरेगा is to create durable assets in rural areas by providing means and objective. By providing 100 days of unskilled manual work to anybody who is willing to do that work. ये MG नरेगा. FII ये भी पूछा हुआ सवाल है एग्जाम में, बट हाँ अब ये पुराना हो गया क्योंकि MG नरेगा काफी पुरानी स्कीम है, बट आई थिंक 2011 और 12 का सवाल है ये. So objective is to build durable assets in rural areas by providing 100 days of unskilled manual work to those who are willing to do that work. So let's say a Panchayat Bhavan has to be created. On that Panchayat Bhavan, the total expenditure incurred is, let's say, 100 crore rupees. And how will that be incurred? That will be incurred in 2 parts. One, purchasing cement, steel, bricks, etc. for that Bhavan, buying land for that Bhavan, and by providing wages to workers who are going to build that Bhavan. So 100 crores is total expenditure there. And out of the 100 CR, some money will be spent on, broadly speaking, material and broadly on men. MG नरेगा has this defined ratio कि कितना men पे spend होगा, कितना material पे spend होगा. The money that is which is being spent for giving out wages, salary, वो तो हो गया हमारा purely a revenue expense. But the money which is being spent on building on purchasing material, that money, even though categorized as a revenue expense, is of the nature of a capital expense. I'll repeat, even though categorized as a revenue expense is of the nature of a capital expense. Indian government gives a grant to Afghanistan government. Indian government spends money. हमने ग्रांट दिया अफगानिस्तान गवर्नमेंट को $100 मिलियन का, तो हमने पैसा खर्च किया कि नहीं किया? What kind of expenditure is this? Revenue expense, capital expense? ग्रांट दिया है, रेवेन्यू. लोन दिया होता तो कैपिटल होता, ग्रांट है तो रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंस है. We gave this grant for the purpose of building a football stadium. Afghanistan government, Indian government gives a grant. We give a grant, it is a revenue expense for us. Afghanistan government receives the money, it is a revenue receipt for them. Why? Because it is not on account of reduction of assets or increase in liability. तो उन्होंने जो receive किया है, their receipt is also a revenue receipt. But how will this money be spent? It will be spent for creation of some asset, infrastructure. That means expenditure will be of the nature of capital expenditure. So Indian government, when it is compiling its accounts, Indian government categorizes that expenditure as a revenue expense. क्योंकि हमने तो grant दिया है, तो हमारा तो revenue expense है. Versus Afghanistan government जब वो अपना account बना रही है, it will categorize that expenditure as a capital expense. So look at it from India's perspective. Even though the money that we gave was on revenue account, it is ultimately being used on capital account. Indian government gives money to UP government. Any kind of money that Indian government gives to UP government, which is not a loan, that gets categorized as a revenue expense of Indian government. Central scheme, central sector scheme, centrally sponsored, any kind of money that Indian government gives to UP government, that is categorized as a revenue expense of Indian government. But some part of that expense is of the nature of it is going to be spent for creation of capital asset. तो जब Indian government ने अपने accounts compile किए, it categorizes that expenditure as a revenue expenditure versus its ultimate use is of the nature of a capital expenditure. Identify these expenses which are even though classified as revenue but their nature is capital expense. ऐसे expense को identify करो and that becomes your effective capital expenditure. That is why वो जो पहली slide में बोला था ना कि वो क्यों अलग लिखा हुआ है वहाँ पे. Grants to states for creation of capital assets. It is a grant to state because it is a grant, hence it is a revenue expenditure of the center. But the grant's purpose is that it is for creation of capital assets. Hence, ultimately it is being used as a capital expenditure. Even though classified as revenue expense, since its use is ultimately capital expense, hence, एक काम करते हैं जो हमारा खुद का कैपिटल एक्सपेंस है उसमें इस टाइप के एक्सपेंसेस को ऐड कर लेते हैं and then arrive at effective capital expenditure. Capital expenditure and grants in aid for creation of capital assets. This becomes our effective capital expenditure. So you classify government expenses like this. क्या तरीका है expense classify करने का? You look at center's expense, center's transfers, out of which some transfers would be such which are given to states for creation of capital assets. You add that to capital expenditure and then you have effective capital expenditure of the government. सबको clear है क्या है? Effective capital expenditure वाला part समझ में आया है? Grants to states for creation of capital assets. Even though classified as a revenue expense, since it is ultimately being spent on capital purposes, hence we treat it with some special treatment. Clear है? चलो अब पूछो किसको क्या सवाल है. हाथ खड़े करो किसको क्या सवाल पूछना है. एक एक करके. पीछे जिसने पहले हाथ उठाया था.
Sir, what's about the collateral free loan?
What is the
Collateral free loan.
collateral? मतलब
I mean, they don't need to deposit anything.
anything नहीं थोड़ा vague लोगे नहीं.
Security, yes.
Security. Collateral free loan means the other party, the borrower, is not giving any kind of security. That becomes a collateral free loan. Indian government lends, bank lends to anybody. Indian government छोड़ो, बैंक ने किसी को lend कर दिया without taking any security in return.
Sir, I'm talking about in sense of last year central government given some loan to the states.
Collateral free loans.
Yes.
हाँ बिल्कुल.
year.
क्यों नहीं दे सकती है? सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट लोन देती है, कई एंटिटीज को देती है, इंक्लूडिंग स्टेट्स को देती है, विदाउट एनी कोलैटरल इन रिटर्न.
So is it a special treatment?
इज इट
Special treatment?
स्पेशल ट्रीटमेंट? मतलब इफ यू वांट टू क्लासिफाई एज टोटल कोलैटरल फ्री लोन्स गिवन बाय सेंटर तो वहां पे इन चीज को स्पेशल ट्रीटमेंट बोल दो. ऐसा कुछ स्पेशल ट्रीटमेंट नहीं है कोलैटरल फ्री लोन्स का. इट इज सिंपली अ टर्म व्हिच इज स्पेसिफाइंग दैट हाउ मच अमाउंट ऑफ मनी सेंटर हैज गिवन विदाउट टेकिंग एनी सिक्योरिटी इन रिटर्न फ्रॉम एनीबॉडी एल्स.
Sir, what if the Indian government gives credit to Central Asian countries as it is given? So will it be counted in revenue or capital?
It gives credit.
Okay.
मतलब लोन.
Kind of loan, 100 million credit in which they can do anything. Matlab there is a third category, right? You can grant them, you can give them credit.
Credit और लोन तो सेम चीज है. What
sir,
you are
मतलब-
trying to say is something called as LOC.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Line of credit.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sorry.
Line of credit is also credit.
Okay.
Line of credit is simply a loan that is given like a window. India opens a $100 million LOC for Bangladesh, meaning Indian government has said that we are giving you a permanent loan of $100 million as and when you need it, you can simply take it. Line of credit. So we have opened a LOC for you up to $100 million, meaning you can come at any time borrow this much amount of money from us. आप एक तरीके से permanently इस debt में रह सकते हो. Indian government has opened that $100 million LOC for Bangladesh. Doesn't mean that Indian government has lent to Bangladesh. Bangladesh government will come and borrow from Indian government. Let's say it borrows $5 million. Because 5 is less than 100 million. That means Bangladesh can borrow even more than that. It will come and borrow 25 million more, 30 million more, 40 million more. जब तक 100 मिलियन नहीं हो जाता तब तक बांग्लादेश गवर्नमेंट इजीली बिना किसी कंडीशन के बिना पूछे बोरो कर सकती है. इट कैन सिंपली बोरो दैट मनी. आई हैव ओपनड अ LOC फ्रॉम यू. You can borrow beyond that also. Bangladesh government says we want to borrow more than that. So Indian government will say because you have exhausted your LOC limit, therefore now you can borrow on some higher rate of interest from us. That is what LOC is. Because it is ultimately lending, hence it is obviously capital expenditure. ठीक है? बोलो.
Hello. So basically, I want to know about the difference between the effective revenue deficit and effective capital expenditure. In the first one, we are taking the difference, or in the second one, we are taking the sum. Basically.
अपना सवाल दोबारा से बोलो.
Effective.
मेरे लिए नहीं, अपने लिए.
Okay. In effective revenue deficit, are we
Effective revenue deficit.
Yeah.
वर्सेस दूसरा सवाल क्या पूछा तुमने?
Effective capital expenditure.
तो दोनों अलग अलग चीजें नहीं है बिल्कुल.
हाँ. Yes.
दोनों के, यार क्यों बात कर रहे हो? दोनों के कंपोनेंट में कुछ समानता हो सकती है. बोथ कैन हैव सिमिलर कंपोनेंट्स बट दीज आर टू डिफरेंट कॉन्सेप्ट्स. व्हाट इज अ डेफिसिट? अभी हम वैसे डेफिसिट पे आएंगे. डेफिसिट डेफिशिएंसी ऑफ समथिंग. समथिंग इज इन एक्सेस वर्सेस व्हाट यू हैव इज लेस. उसको कैसे कैलकुलेट करेंगे, उसका कुछ फॉर्मूला होगा. वर्सेस अभी हमने देखा इफेक्टिव कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर. योर कैपिटल, क्या हुआ यार? योर कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर, टोटल कैपिटल एक्सपेंसेस आर समथिंग. Government spends money for building assets, reducing liabilities, capital expenses. It spends money on revenue purposes, giving loans to states, grants to states, but some of those grants or loans were given for creation of capital assets. उनको categorize तो किया as revenue expenses, not loans, sorry, grants. उनको categorize तो किया as revenue expenses, but the purpose was capital expense. Hence, उनको हमने specially यहाँ पे add कर लिया कि there is a effective capital expenditure. Effective word बता दो. Capital का मतलब क्या है? कि केवल capital expenditure. Effective में इस part को और add कर लो. Fine. चलो और कुछ बोलो.
Sir, what if the central government gives loans to the state governments on 0%? So are they revenue expenditure or capital expenditure?
Take a guess.
Revenue.
Take the correct guess.
बट उसमें तो सर कोई कैपिटल क्रिएट ही नहीं हो रहे ना.
लोन है ना. बाय डेफिनेशन आपने क्या बोला? लोन है, मतलब वापस करना है ना. प्रिंसिपल अमाउंट मनी हैज बीन गिवन एंड दैट मनी हैज टू बी रिटर्न इवन दो एट अ जीरो रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट, बट मनी हैज टू बी रिटर्न, राइट? सो इट इज अ कैपिटल एक्सपेंस ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट.
थैंक यू सर.
चलो बोलो.
Center gives the loan to the state.
हाँ.
So center gives the loan to the state.
हाँ जी.
For example, UP, and UP spend this amount in the maintenance cost, right? Like in the maintenance of the school building.
Yes, yes, yes.
So this expenditure goes where?
ये expenditure. Central government lends to state, UP government, and UP government spends that money for maintenance of schools. Central government अपने अकाउंट बनाएगी, खाते बनाएगी, UP government अपने बनाएगी. Central government has lent money. I have lent money, that means it's a loan, it's my capital expenditure. UP government is free to use that money in whatever way it can, provided center did not put a condition. It is spending that money for maintenance. That means for them, it is a capital receipt and a revenue expense. क्योंकि उन्होंने borrow किया तो उनकी capital receipt हो गई है, लेकिन expenditure कैसा है? Maintenance के ऊपर है, hence it's a revenue expense for them. Receipt उनकी capital है, लेकिन expenditure revenue है. चलो. Composition of total expenses is here. Visualize and see the yellow bar and the gray bar. Central sector schemes and establishment expense of the center. Which is the biggest component of total government of central government? अच्छा, this is apart from interest. ये interest के सिवा है, this expenditure. This is other grants, loan, finance commission grant, CSS, central sector expenditure, central sector scheme. अच्छा, other central sector is interest, sorry. Other central sector is interest. And establishment expense. Sorry, I'll repeat. Central sector expenditure, this is the interest part. I'll repeat, दोबारा से. This gray bar is other central sector expenditure, which is mostly interest expenditure. This yellow bar is central sector scheme. This is where I want you to focus. Central sector schemes के ऊपर expenses has been rising or not? As in, कंसिस्टेंटली राइजिंग वो तो अलग हो जाएगा, बट यस इट हैज बीन राइजिंग. पहले देखो 2019-20 में कितना था, 2021, 22, 23 ये तीनों सेम चीज़ हैं. बजट एज इन 2023-24 का बजट एस्टिमेट, ये इसका रेवेन्यू रिवाइज एस्टिमेट, और दिस इज बीई ऑफ 24-25. सेंट्रल सेक्टर स्कीम्स, सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट्स की अभी बात करें सेंट्रल सेक्टर स्कीम्स की. सेंट्रल सेक्टर स्कीम्स, expenses on central sector schemes have been on the generally speaking rising trend. Centrally sponsored schemes versus central sector schemes. Till the time we had planning commission used to formulate CS as well as CSS. More importantly, planning commission used to lay down conditions for states to spend money on these CSS. Planning commission would tell the states कि ये condition है, इसी condition में आप पैसा खर्च कर सकते हो, तभी हम आप only then we are going to sponsor the scheme for you. Post planning commission, post 12th 5-year plan, when Niti Aayog was established, वो 12th 5-year plan से पहले establish कर दिया गया था. When Niti Aayog was established, a committee was formed of chief ministers. That chief ministers committee decided that what will be the new scheme, what will be the new scope of centrally sponsored schemes. CSS का नया scope क्या होगा? So we had till that point around 120 CSS. Now we have around 30 CSS, centrally sponsored schemes. Centrally sponsored schemes में जो total allocation है that has reduced. Why has centrally sponsored scheme allocation reduced, and correspondingly central sector scheme allocation has increased? CSS allocation, CSS centrally sponsored scheme allocation, CSS allocation has reduced. Central sector scheme allocation has increased. Why? Take a guess. दोबारा से सवाल सुन लो फिर उसके बाद. सेंट्रल सेक्टर और सेंट्रल स्पॉन्सर्ड क्लियर है? सेंट्रल सेक्टर मतलब सेंटर की अपनी स्कीम, सेंट्रल स्पॉन्सर्ड मतलब सेंटर जो स्टेट्स की स्कीम को पार्टली फाइनेंस कर रहा है. The total outlay, the total outgo on centrally sponsored schemes has been reducing. The total outgo on central sector schemes has been increasing. Why? Piche, bolo, yes.
Sir, because there is a lot of duplication of schemes, be it in center and state. So, subsuming some centrally sponsored schemes into central sector schemes.
Good. One reason, good. Or what else? For? नहीं. Equities में क्या बोलो?
फिर one time center is located to implement the scheme, and second time to revise या modified, there is not allocated the fund improperly.
नहीं. No. Or what else? Huh? States not abiding the conditions. No, ऐसा हो ही नहीं सकता है. State मना कर देगा लेने से, लेकिन condition अगर दिए तो condition तो abide करनी पड़ेगी. One last, बोलो. Yes, with the cap. बोलो.
Sir, due to GST, states lost their taxation powers.
So, वो तो receipt का part है GST. यहाँ पे तो हम center के expenditure की बात कर रहे हैं. The total amount of money, अब सुनो, the total money is being spent for central sector versus, देखो ये वो assertion reason वाले statement होते हैं ना, statement 1 is correct, 2 is correct and 2 is the correct reason for 1. The total money being spent for central sector schemes has reduced because simply Finance Commission increased the untied grants to states. Finance Commission was giving 32% to states earlier. Now how much does it give to states? 42%. जो Finance Commission के द्वारा दिया गया money है states को, वो tied है, मतलब condition के साथ आता है, बिना किसी condition के आता है. वो states का right है, that is right of state, that comes without any condition. Center simply says states will get this money, Finance Commission says states will get this money, therefore they simply get that money. वर्सेस जो सेंट्रली स्पॉन्सर्ड स्कीम्स का पैसा था, दैट वाज अ टाइड ग्रांट. प्लानिंग कमीशन यूज्ड टू ले डाउन कंडीशंस फॉर दोस स्कीम्स. Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, you please procure from only this vendor. You please serve only this meal at this time to the students. Only then you will be given a sponsorship for that scheme. Post Finance Commission recommendations, 15th, 16th FC. Post 15th and 16th FC, what has happened is states' share in total taxes has increased. As a result, the total untied devolution to states, meaning unconditional money given to states, has increased. Because that money has increased, naturally कहीं ना कहीं से कम करना होगा ना. कहाँ से कम करोगे? Centrally sponsored schemes से. So centrally sponsored, the tied grant थे. So CSS allocation has come down versus CS allocation has gone up. Center now focuses more on its own schemes. अपनी schemes set CSS बन गई, एक बार को तय हो गई, अब वो CSS are continuing. Versus central sector scheme, center keeps on making some new schemes, some of the other scheme, and hence it allocates money to those schemes. Because untied allocation to states has increased, hence the tied allocation in form of CSS has decreased. ठीक है? Trend आ रहा है समझ में अब? Interest expense, obviously the biggest component, but central sector scheme, see that this is also a very big component. It used to be a small part, but now it is a very big part of total expenses, right? Central sector schemes. This is with respect to specific announcements in the budget. 4 key areas they have said, ठीक है ना? Poor, women, youth and farmers. Fine. मोदी जी ने बोला आपसे 4 कास्ट ये हो गई. Manner of, let's say, focus: inclusive development, geographically inclusive and socially inclusive, and he says that these are the areas that we have to focus upon. Some aspects for poverty, multi-dimensional poverty. When was last, how do we measure poverty? What is our official survey of measuring poverty? National Consumption Expenditure, NCES or NHES, National Household Expenditure बोल लो, Consumption Expenditure. That is our official survey of measuring poverty. When was last NCES conducted? 2011-12. उसके बाद से अभी तक NCES नहीं है. And government is saying we have uplifted 25 crore people out of poverty. तो सरकार कैसे बोल रही है जब NCES ही नहीं हुआ तो? क्योंकि हम कहाँ से मेजर कर रहे हैं? मल्टी डायमेंशनल पॉवर्टी से मेजर कर रहे हैं. Multi-dimensional poverty is in fact, stricter criteria as compared to consumption expenditure based poverty. The Tendulkar poverty जो हमारी official poverty है. MPI poverty is a stricter criteria. We have been able to uplift 25 crore people out of multi-dimensional poverty in around last 9 to 10 years. How do we assess multi-dimensional poverty? Three heads. क्या क्या heads हैं? Health, education, standard of living. The international MPI has 10 indicators. Niti Aayog's MPI has 2 additional indicators. So our MPI poverty line is obviously stricter as compared to consumption expenditure poverty line. And if we see that we have been able to uplift 25 CR people, that is a tremendous achievement. What data is required? Which survey is there to assess multidimensional poverty? हमको डेटा तो चाहिए होगा ना असेस करने के लिए कितने लोग अपलिफ्ट हुए पॉवर्टी से. तो कैसे, कौन सा सर्वे है? NFHS, नेशनल फैमिली हेल्थ सर्वे. When was last NFHS conducted? 2019 and remaining part in 21, क्योंकि 20 में नहीं कंडक्ट हो पाया था. उससे पहले कब हुआ था? 2015 में. उससे पहले 2005 में. So 2005 to 15 and then 15 to 2019 and 21. Now these latest number, जो 25 crore वाले number है, ये कहाँ से आया है? This has come from rapid surveys. So NFHS is a comprehensive survey that NFHS has been carried out till 2021, but at the same time we also carry out some rapid surveys. जैसे global MPI है, वो तो हर साल रिपोर्ट आती है. ग्लोबल MPI कहाँ से इंफॉर्मेशन लेती है इंडिया की, कि इंडिया में कितनी महिलाओं को 30. There are some dimensions on there are some indicators on multidimensional poverty. How many women have, how many households do not have water at a 30 minutes of walking distance? How many households are using some primitive fuel, meaning solid fuel? How many households do not have a modern sanitation facility? How many children are not able to attend school for 55% of time? How many households have people below 18 years of age who has died in last 5 years? These are some of the indicators on multidimensional poverty. So you need to know performance of households, each of households on these indicators. Where do you get that information from? NFHS तो है, but yes, NFHS हर साल carry out थोड़ी ना होता है. We have some rapid surveys for that. There are state level rapid surveys from which we continuously keep on assessing, and it is from those rapid surveys, applying these standards on those rapid survey data, we find that we have been able to uplift around 25 crore people from multidimensional poverty. From 2005 to 15, we were able to uplift around 27 crore people from multidimensional poverty. From 15 to around 22, we have been able to uplift around 25 crore people more from multidimensional poverty. Per year, अगर देखा जाए, तो per year our MPI was declining by around 9%, which was already extremely high, exceptionally high, and it has further increased to around 11% every year. तो 9% हम लगभग poverty हर साल कम करते थे, reducing poverty by around 9% every year between 2005 and 15. Further increasing the pace to around 11% between 2015 and 22. So our poverty reduction pace has also increased, right? Some of the schemes, अब ये याद कर लो, मेरे से प्लीज बुलवाना मत ये. स्वनिधि स्कीम, देखो इंपॉर्टेंट ये है कौन सी मिनिस्ट्री के अंदर आती है. याद कर लो, स्वनिधि स्कीम किस चीज की है? Credit assistance to street vendors comes under Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. PM जनमन योजना, ये किस चीज की स्कीम है? PVTG की, particularly vulnerable tribal groups की. There are 9 ministries involved there. अब एग्जाम में यही पूछा जाएगा कि PM जनमन is under which ministry? There is no one particular ministry which is implementing PM janman. There are 9 ministries which are part of this. This comprehensively addresses PVTGs. Addresses skill development, availability of water, sanitation, malnourishment. This PM Janman scheme is a comprehensive scheme comprising of both central sector and centrally sponsored scheme. दोनों है PM जनमन के अंदर. जनमन एक बड़ा प्रोग्राम है, इसमें दोनों स्कीम्स हैं, सेंट्रल सेक्टर भी है, सेंट्रल सेक्टर भी है, सेंट्रली स्पॉन्सर्ड भी है. प्लस देयर आर मल्टीपल मिनिस्ट्रीज इन्वॉल्वड हियर, एंड वी हैव गॉट विश्वकर्मा योजना. ये रिसेंट है. देखो इंपॉर्टेंट है या नहीं है ये मैं नहीं बता सकता हूँ, तुमको कोई नहीं बता सकता है. सो इंपॉर्टेंट और नॉट, बट दे आर इन देयर इन द बजट. नाउ यू सी देम, हेंस यू रिमेंबर देम. विश्वकर्मा योजना किस चीज की है सबको पता ही है, ठीक है. ये तो आपने आर्टिजन्स एंड क्राफ्ट्समैन की, राइट. ओके. विद रिस्पेक्ट टू विमेन, again they ask questions, trend based questions on this. For example, labor force participation rate of women. So LFPR has increased to around 37%, so that is an important achievement. LFPR, सवाल ये आएगा कि भाई LFPR of women is low. Yes. LFPR of women has been consistently rising. Yes or no? Huh? This year it has increased, but at the same time LFPR has generally shown a declining trend. LFPR of women पिछले 3 साल से बढ़ता हुआ हमको दिख रहा है, but उससे पहले LFPR of women was actually on the falling side. So again, trends matter here. Yes, around 37% LFPR of women, which is again good as compared to ourselves in past, still very low, number one, and number two, it has not consistently increased. It has decreased actually, and then it has started to show an increment only in very recent years, LFPR of women. Reasons for low LFPR or a falling LFPR of women? One reason, ठीक है, और हाँ लो LFPR ऑफ वुमेन का क्या क्या कारण है? हाँ, सिक्योरिटी एट वर्क प्लेस, ओके. हाँ, अनइक्वल वेजेस बोलो. एक सेकंड.
अर्ली मैरिजेस.
अर्ली मैरिज, पेट्रियार्की के सिवा कुछ और? हाँ, yes, yes. मतलब it can ultimately boil down to patriarchal aspect, but yes, before that.
Sir, disguised unemployment.
एक सेकंड यार, एक सेकंड बोलो.
So first of all, there can be multiple factors.
Yes,
so
yes, certainly.
social factors, so we all know patriarchy.
हाँ,
and
yes.
all. Economic factors also. That there is a growing informal sector, so that there ultimately it is not incentive to women to go. And other factors are there is a trend of rising income of men. So people think that why to go a job when your husband is paying, or when your husband is giving you
Earning enough for the house. Don't think of it as like the husband is giving it to you.
and there can be also reasons, sir.
हाँ, yes, certainly. Yes, fine. और what else? अब पीछे से किसके पास माइक था? कौन बोल रहा था? Migration, yes.
Sir, disguised unemployment.
हाँ?
Disguised unemployment.
Okay, what else? More, हाँ, तो positive reason बोलो. Positive, देखो, बोलो, last.
So they are mostly involved in care economy.
So
that's why they are working, but their work is not calculated in the economy.
Work is not captured. That is not part of LFP, labor force. चलो बस ठीक है. अरे सबके उत्तर सही हैं यार. गलत कोई नहीं. ये ऐसा सवाल है जिसमें आप गलत उत्तर दोगे तो फिर आप गलत क्लास में बैठे हो. Everybody will be obviously 100% right here. But yes, two major reasons. Please listen. Please understand. When I say two major reasons, what I mean to say is that there are reasons that are there in the background all the time. As in patriarchy is not as that it's new. Societal reason is new, or it is, let's say, unique to our country. When we talk about reasons for low LFPR of women in the country, or a more important, declining LFPR, then we have to look at not these generic reasons which one have been there, are there, and chances are will be there. We would not like them to be there, but certainly they are there. That's a fact. And second, they are there not just in our country, but across the world. So what is something specific to us? Care economy is not specific to us. It's there everywhere in the world. Or discrimination based on wages is not specific to us. High wages for men, low wages for women for same work, that is not just in India, it's everywhere. Specifically speaking, now positive aspect kya hai? One, we have been seeing that incomes are rising. Since household incomes are rising, and therefore need for more number of people to work is less. And in that more number of people, the one who obviously doesn't get to have a choice becomes the woman. So that becomes the patriarchal aspect. But the specific reason is incomes of the country are rising. Second, another, ये भी positive कारण है, उसका उस positive के पीछे एक negative aspect है, as in discriminatory aspect है. And second is a greater enrollment in higher education. Earlier, women used to study one less, and second only up to a limited class, 6th class, 8th class. Now there is a greater time that you spend in studying, including for graduation. As such, pehle more number of women used to enter labor force. Now there is a delay of some time. As a result of that, again LFPR has fallen because of less number of women, more number of women enrolling for higher education now. तो पहले 6th class के बाद, let's say every wrong answer, but just for understanding, every woman used to become eligible for workforce. That means मान लेते हैं 100 women की population थी, and out of 100, let's say 70 were becoming eligible, were showing their interest to work because they have passed class 6th. Now उन 70 की जगह, now many of them are studying for a longer duration, as a result of which now the number of women entering labor force every year have declined drastically. So that becomes a positive reason. अब ये जो trend था, because of more enrollment in higher education, as in beyond class 6, this trend starts from around late 80s or 90s. And now what we see, especially in last few years, and going to see more in coming years, अब वो जो extra years आपने school में बिताए थे, now they are graduating and now they are coming into labor force. Because now they are coming to labor force, hence chances are now we are going to see an increase in LFPR of women again. So it fell temporarily because of greater enrollment, greater time that is spent in education institutions. Now because अब वो एक तरीके से normalize हो रहा है धीरे धीरे, आगे जाके और बढ़ेगा. Now we are going to see an increase in LFPR because those women are now entering workforce. So hence we see that it is increasing now. Okay? Plus also more enrollment in STEM courses, as Nirmala ji said that we have probably the highest enrollment in STEM courses anywhere in the world. Around 43% was the number that I think she said. So we have highest enrollment in STEM courses of women, as in total STEM courses में जो भी लोग पढ़ रहे हैं उसमें around 43% women है. So again, matter of pride for us. PM Awas, most houses are in women name or joint names. लखपति दीदी scheme क्या है? लखपति दीदी पता है ना? Self-help groups, है ना? Via self-help groups, you have been able to make women earn around 1 lakh rupees or more income per year. So that become लखपति दीदी, right? Target is कि उसको 2 करोड़ से बढ़ा के 3 करोड़ करना है. Extension of Ayushman Bharat to Anganwadi workers, Asha workers and others. What is the eligibility criteria for Ayushman Bharat? देखो ये चीज पूछी जाती है पेपर में, बहुत ही कॉमन सवाल है एग्जाम के कि कोई एक स्कीम जो कि बड़ी वेल नोन, जैसे एमजी नरेगा का मैंने बताया ना, सवाल एमजी नरेगा के ऊपर 2-3 साल पूछा गया एंड वन ऑफ द क्वेश्चन वाज हु अमंग द फॉलोइंग इज एलिजिबल टू वर्क अंडर एमजी नरेगा. Those who are BPL, those who are in rural areas, इस टाइप से सवाल थे. Anybody can work in MG Narega provided you are willing to work for unskilled manual work. Anybody, you are living here, you want to go and do unskilled manual work, you can go and enroll yourself in MG Narega. Demand driven, yes. आयुष्मान भारत का कौन बेनिफिशियरी है? पीएम आवास का कौन बेनिफिशियरी है? ये नहीं पूछा जाएगा एग्जाम में कि पीएम आवास में कितने घर महिलाओं के नाम के हैं. तो स्कीम को इस तरीके से पढ़ना. अब मैं नहीं बताऊंगा, तुम अपने आप देख लेना. हाउ डू वी असेस बेनिफिशियरीज नाउ? एनीबडी नोज? यस, सही है, किसी ने बोला यस यस यस. व्हाट डिड यू से? SECC, Socio Economic Caste Census. SECC is now the eligibility criteria for any enrollment, any scheme enrollment. You have SECC, Socio Economic Caste Census, in which you assess deprivation of entities on certain criteria. We have 10 criteria there. आप किस criteria के ऊपर deprived हो, वहां पे आपकी deprivation निकल के आती है. And based on your deprivation, you are made eligible for a respective scheme. जैसे जस्ट एक एग्जांपल दे रहा हूं, पीएम आवास योजना. तो इन SECC there is a criteria कि भाई कौन पक्का हाउस में रह रहा है, कौन नहीं रह रहा है. Who is living in कच्चा और सेमी पक्का हाउस. That means those who are identified as living in those houses become the beneficiaries of PM Awas Yojana. So all the schemes now, even Ayushman Bharat, all these schemes have these eligibility criteria कि भाई SECC से हम पता लगाएंगे. ठीक है? So now Anganwadi workers, Asha workers have also been made eligible for benefits under Ayushman Bharat scheme. ठीक है? तो देख लेना है चीज. For youth, there are some schemes for skilling. One important scheme is, अब उसका कुछ नाम नहीं है, there is a technology R&D fund that the government has set up, which provides long-term interest-free or very low-cost loans for research and development. So that is one important thing. बाकी उसके सिवा it was mostly which is ongoing schemes. कुछ नया scheme नहीं है. New one is just this. Technology development एक R&D fund सरकार ने बनाया है to provide long-term loans, interest-free और low-cost loans to entrepreneurs. ये purpose है इसका. Basically beneficiary youth ही होने वाला है. Farmers, you got various schemes here. PM Kisan, कौन सी स्कीम है PM Kisan? 6,000 रुपए वाली स्कीम जो है, डायरेक्ट बेनिफिट. We have got फसल बीमा योजना. What is there in फसल बीमा योजना? Crop insurance. A farmer says that I have a crop whose potential value is 5 lakh rupees. Therefore, I want to insure my crop for 5 lakh rupees, up to 5 lakh rupees. If there is a hailstorm, if there is a flood, if there is a drought, if there is some pest attack, something, and because of which I am able to realize a value less than 5 lakh rupees. मैं अपना crop harvest करूंगा, I sell in the market and I get just 3 lakh rupees by selling my crop. That means I get 2 lakh less than what I thought I could got. Because I have insured my crop for a value up to 5 lakh rupees. Hence, now the insurance company will compensate me for the difference of that 2 lakh rupees. Obviously ऐसा नहीं कि भाई मेरे को कम प्राइस मिला इसीलिए मेरे को इंश्योरेंस कंपनी कॉम्पनसेट कर देगी. दैट लेस प्राइस शुड बी बिकॉज ऑफ सम ऑफ दीज फैक्टर्स, जैसे नेचुरल डिजास्टर्स. ये नहीं कि भाई मैंने अपना पुअर क्वालिटी प्रोडक्ट बनाया मार्केट में बेचा इसलिए कम प्राइस मिल गया. इट हैज टू बी बिकॉज ऑफ सम फैक्टर्स. सम डिजास्टर मस्ट हैव स्ट्रक एंड दैट इज व्हाई यू वर एबल टू नॉट रियलाइज the expected value of your crop. Then you get eligible, then you get the benefit of this fasal bima, that is the insurance scheme. Beneficiaries are identified. Farmers are the beneficiaries. Premium समझते हो ना, इंश्योरेंस के लिए प्रीमियम पे करना है. Premium has to be paid. Let's say my crop value insured was 5 lakh. I want to insure my crop for, let's say, for 5 lakh rupees. For that, the premium required is 10,000 rupees. What is the scheme? The scheme says farmer has to pay just 1%, 2% or 5% premium depending upon the crop. अगर horticulture crop है मतलब commercial crop है तो 5% premium pay करना है. Otherwise रबी और खरीफ में 1 and 2% है. So let's say 10,000 rupees the premium. 2% of that becomes 200 rupees. So 200 रुपए farmer को pay करना है. बचा हुआ 9,800 rupees government pay करेगी. कौन सी government? Center and state together. 49% center, 49% state. So the scheme is financed by center, state and the farmer. Farmer pays just 2% premium, but remaining 98% is paid equally by center and state. ठीक है, ये होगी पीएम फसल बीमा योजना. Fertilizers, nano DAP and nano urea. Now this is, again, I am nobody to tell कि UPSC क्या सवाल पूछेगी, but एक वो हंच वाली चीज है. आई थिंक दिस इज समथिंग दैट मे बी आस्क्ड इन द एग्जाम. नैनो डैप और नैनो यूरिया, नैनो फर्टिलाइजर्स के ऊपर. दिस इज साइंस एंड टेक का सवाल है, बट दिस इज काइंड ऑफ अमंग्स दोस फेवरेट क्वेश्चंस ऑफ यूपीएससी. और वो जो हर बार कहीं ना कहीं से आ जाते हैं ना, पता नहीं चलता कि कहाँ से सवाल आ गया है. ये उन सवालों में से है. नैनो डैप, नैनो यूरिया. दे विल आस्क व्हाट आर द फॉलोइंग, व्हिच ऑफ द फॉलोइंग आर बेनिफिट्स ऑफ नैनो फर्टिलाइजर्स. Nitrogen per unit volume in nano urea versus normal urea. Nitrogen per unit of volume ज़्यादा किस में है, नैनो यूरिया में है या फिर नॉर्मल यूरिया में है? इसलिए मात खा जाओगे. नाइट्रोजन की मात्रा कम है लेकिन उसकी एब्जॉर्प्शन कैपेसिटी ज़्यादा है. हाँ, सरफेस एरिया वाइज एब्जॉर्ब ज़्यादा होगा. अमाउंट ऑफ नाइट्रोजन इज मोर इन योर जो नॉर्मल फर्टिलाइजर है, जो ग्रेनी फर्टिलाइजर है. तो पर यूनिट वॉल्यूम 1 लीटर में या 1 मिलीलीटर में पर यूनिट वॉल्यूम ऑब्वियसली नाइट्रोजन इज मोर इन योर नॉर्मल यूरिया, नॉट इन नैनो यूरिया. बट बिकॉज इट इज ऑफ स्मॉल पार्टिकल हेंस इट्स एब्जॉर्प्शन इज बेटर. तो कम में भी वो ज़्यादा अच्छा से काम करता है. So it becomes nano fertilizer. So please, this is science and tech question. Please read it. किसने डेवलप किया है ये? IFCO has developed it. ठीक है? So please read this thing. This is again, I don't know whether this will be asked this year, next year, or will it all be asked. But there's something which is science and tech, and also a question that has been many times asked in the exam regarding some fertilizer. जैसे नीम कोटिंग के ऊपर they have asked question 2 times. नीम कोटिंग क्यों favorable है? They asked about varieties of pulses, varieties of rice developed in the Pusa Institute or by ICRI. So they have asked these science and tech questions with respect to agriculture several times. So this is one of the latest things. So please refer to it. Nano urea and nano DAP. ठीक है? मत्स्य संपदा योजना. हाँ, फिशरीज है. ठीक है. नेचर ऑफ क्वेश्चंस. मेरा काम यहाँ पे तुमको बताऊं कि किस तरीके से चीजों को पढ़ना है. Again, they have asked this question, I think 2018. We have more inland fisheries than coastal fisheries. Yes or no? Area under fisheries, inland versus coastal, कहाँ पे ज़्यादा है? Inland में या coastal में? inland में it is around 2 times that in coastal. So it is 33% coastal, around 66% inland fisheries. Government started this, ये मत्स्य संपदा योजना नहीं है, पुरानी है, but government is now increasing allocation for मत्स्य संपदा योजना. So when when this introduced this scheme, they asked this question regarding fisheries. Now because this scheme is back in news, maybe again they can ask question about fisheries, right? तो अब ज़्यादा सवाल fisheries पे कुछ बनता नहीं है. सवाल यही बनता है that India is, let's say, largest producer of fisheries products in the world, or second largest or third largest. Shrimp के हम largest producer हैं, fish के second largest producer हैं. Export, India is the largest exporter of fishery product, yes or no? No. हम consume खुद ही ज़्यादा करते हैं, तो इसलिए हम श्रिम्प हम लेकिन एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं. श्रिम्प के हम लार्जेस्ट प्रोड्यूसर भी हैं और लार्जेस्ट एक्सपोर्टर भी हैं. श्रिम्प के, श्रिम्प कहाँ पे प्रोड्यूस होता है? हाँ, मोस्टली ऑन द ईस्टर्न साइड, ईस्ट कोस्ट, विच इज मोस्टली ऑन द आंध्रा कोस्ट. सो आंध्र प्रदेश एज इन फिशरीज इन आंध्र प्रदेश आर बिगेस्ट प्रोड्यूसर ऑफ श्रिम्प इन इंडिया. वर्ल्ड में फिर एक रीजन को नहीं लेंगे, आंध्र प्रदेश को. इंडिया इज द लार्जेस्ट प्रोड्यूसर ऑफ श्रिम्प एंड वी आर द लार्जेस्ट एक्सपोर्टर ऑफ श्रिम्प ऑल्सो. लेस कंज्यूम्ड इन द कंट्री एंड देयरफॉर वी एक्सपोर्ट इट मोर. डेयरी डेवलपमेंट में वी हैव दिस गोकुल का तो लास्ट ईयर सवाल पूछा क्या था, गोकुल मिशन जो है लास्ट ईयर मेंस प्रीलिम्स का सवाल है, 2022 प्रीलिम्स का. क्या है गोकुल मिशन? राष्ट्रीय गोकुल मिशन. एक को भी नहीं पता? अरे दे दो यार उत्तर प्लीज. राष्ट्रीय गोकुल मिशन किस चीज की है? हाँ, अब देखो गोकुल है, तुम गैस तो कर ही लोगे कि है तो मिल्क से, काउ से रिलेटेड. अब है किस चीज की स्पेसिफिकली? लास्ट ईयर प्रीलिम्स का सवाल है 2022 का. एक आध ने तो पेपर दिया लास्ट ईयर. आई कैन सी सम ऑफ माय ओल्ड स्टूडेंट्स आल्सो. एनहांसिंग
सर.
हाँ, यस, somebody says. हाँ, कोई बोला.
Indigenous cow breeds.
Indigenous, हाँ, पीछे से भी सही. Yes. Increase the productivity of indigenous cow breeds. That is what Gokul Mission is. ठीक है. And again, an allocation. The finance minister also used the term in his speech, also in her speech as well. The focus is on increasing productivity of our indigenous cattle. ठीक है. So this is about farmers. Capital expenses. अब हमने इसको कई बार डिस्कस कर लिया है. Nature of question. Increasing trend of capital expenses, right? दिख रहा है यहाँ पे increasing trend. More specific question, इस बार कितना increment है capital expenses में? This year the increment is 11%. Last year the increment was around 22%. Before that increment was around 33%. So 33, 22, 11. Percentage increase in capital expenditure. Percentage increase in capital expenditure has been consistently increasing in last 5 years. Yes or no? Percentage increase in capital expenditure has been consistently increasing in last 5 years. Yes or no? False. Capital expenditure as a proportion of GDP has been consistently increasing in last 5 years. Capital expenditure as a proportion of GDP has been consistently increasing in last 5 years. Yes. Capital expenditure में percent, again, पहले तो समझो कि ये इकोनॉमिक्स के साथ साथ इंग्लिश कॉम्प्रिहेंशन का भी पेपर है तुम्हारा. So not just facts but also being able to understand what kind of question is asked. The first statement was, चलो अब मैं तुमको फैक्ट और स्टेटमेंट दोनों बता देता हूँ. कैपिटल एक्सपेंसेस हैव बीन राइजिंग. गवर्नमेंट हैज अ फोकस ऑन कैपिटल एक्सपेंसेस, राइट? कैपिटल आउट ऑफ टोटल एक्सपेंसेस, सम आर रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंसेस, सम आर कैपिटल एक्सपेंसेस. इंटरेस्ट एक्सपेंस इज व्हाट काइंड ऑफ एक्सपेंस? Revenue expense. Interest is a revenue, obviously interest payment is a revenue expense. A loan interest payment comprises of 20% of expenses. स्टार्टिंग में भी बात करी थी हमने. सरकार का टोटल खर्चा 47 लाख करोड़ रुपए, 47 lakh crore rupees, out of which around 10 lakh crore rupees is interest and interest only. That means around 20% expenditure is only on interest. So government spends money on revenue purposes, on capital purposes. One. Second, revenue expenses are obviously much more than capital expenses. Capital expenses, because they are asset creating, they are more desirable. Revenue expenses are necessary because you have to incur those expenses. Government has been focusing on increasing capital expenses in last few years. Why? Because capital expenses lead to increased productivity of the economy. Better infrastructure, better roads, better ports, all these are capital expenses. So government has been focusing on capital expenses in last few years. As such, our capital expenses have been rising. Each year, we see a greater outlay on capital expenses. Each year, we spend more on capital expenditure as compared to previous year. So capital expenses have been rising, number one. Number two, capital expenses, they have not just been rising, they are also rising as a proportion of total expenditure. Earlier we were spending, just for example, earlier we were spending, let's say, 6% total expenses capital, now we are spending 8%, 9%, 10%. That means capital expenses as a proportion of total expenses increase कर रहे हैं. Capital expenses as a proportion of GDP increase कर रहे हैं. Now, the first statement that I said was, percentage increase in capital expenses has been increasing, meaning last to last year कितना किया था, then last year कितना किया और इस साल कितना किया. Percentage increase in capital expense year over year. In 2019, we spent 100 rupees. In 2020, we spent 133 rupees, 33% increase. In 2021, we spent 155 rupees, around 22% increase. We are spending more, but percentage increment कम हो गया. We are spent this year from 155, we are spending, let's say, 170 rupees. We are spending more, but percentage increment कम हो गया. So capital expenses have been rising. Capital expenses as a proportion of total expenses have been rising. Capital expenses as a proportion of GDP have been rising. Percentage growth in capital expenses over last year, in last 3 years, has fallen. Because 3 years back, our capital expenses increased by 33%. COVID year, and hence we spent lot of money on capital expenses. Opportunity थी तो हमने spend किया, लेकिन permanently तो spend नहीं कर सकते ना, क्योंकि spend करने के लिए ultimately borrow करना पड़ेगा. So where will we get money from? So we are now increasing capital expenses, but relatively the pace of increment has fallen. ठीक है, clear हुआ? Capital expenses के trends. Okay. Some capital expenses, major expenses, housing पे जैसे PM आवास योजना में we are spending money. Renewables में focus on wind energy, focus on rooftop solar, focus on e-buses, focus on some bio manufacturing and all those things. 3 major railway corridors under PM Gati Shakti scheme. क्या है गति शक्ति बताना जरा फटाफट. बोलो जल्दी. A portal to integrate various ministries. Gati Shakti is because an infra project requires multiple ministries and departments to coordinate. Therefore, the major time that is spent in infra project is not on construction, it is on coordination. There is a metro line that has to go. उस metro line के लिए आपको जमीन खोदनी है, जमीन में से कुछ नाली जा रही है, कुछ बिजली की तार जा रही है, फोन की तार, ब्रॉडबैंड की तार जा रही है. That means multiple departments have to be involved there. And this coordination takes maximum time. To coordinate implementation of infra projects, you have this portal called as Gati Shakti portal. So Gati Shakti is that coordination portal that the government has set up, right? So we are now including 3 new railway corridors in that portal so that we can implement them on an expedited basis, right? Viability gap funding किसको बोलते हैं? बोलो बोलो बोलो. Viability gap funding बताओ.
So for example, if any project is almost completed but some more money is required.
No, no. पीछे दे दो.
So when the government feels that this project is profitable, but no one is able to pitch in that amount of investment, so government through
Almost good. The project is desirable, but it is not financially attractive. You have money, you are an infra developer, you have two options, either to build a highway or to build a rural road. Where will you put your money? Highway, because you can collect tolls from that highway, hence your returns are going to be more. Your potential return on a rural road is going to be less as compared to that on a highway. Hence, everybody who has money would like to build highways from that money and not build rural roads from that money. Desirable but not financially viable. इसके viability gap को bridge करने के लिए government will then provide some funding. That is called as viability gap funding, to bridge the viability gap of a project, right? That is called as VGF. So we have VGF in right now existing as part of UDAN scheme. UDAN scheme, Udidesh ka Aam Nagarik. Development of regional connectivity between tier 2, tier 3 cities. वहाँ पे airport develop करने हैं. Nobody would be willing to develop airports, that is invest money in development of airports in, let's say, Lucknow or Banaras or Indore or Bhopal. People would rather build a fourth airport near Delhi rather than building airports in these tier 2, tier 3 cities. So government says we are going to provide some kind of, in some way we are going to make these projects financially viable. हम कुछ tax माफ कर देंगे आपके ऊपर, कुछ charges आपके ऊपर नहीं लगाएंगे. So in some way we are going to reduce your costs so that the project becomes financially viable. This is called as VGF. So we are now introducing VGF in wind energy as well. Wind energy, again, think of it, requires substantial investments, but investments might not be fruitful for the investor. As such, what do we do, or what does the government propose? It has proposed to invest some money initially by itself, so that wind energy investment becomes viable, and hence cost of wind power reduces. People are more willing to adopt wind power as a source of energy. तो ये है viability gap funding. ठीक है, चलो. Some expenses on states for some schemes, development of tourism. ये कुछ expenses और center कर रहा है. States will be asked, again, this results from recent developments with respect to many religious places of historical significance. So government says that we now have to pitch these places for international tourism. Pitch Ayodhya, pitch Sarnath, pitch Kushinagar, pitch all these places for international religious tourism, and states will be given some funding for these purposes, branding, marketing purposes के लिए. Plus, at the same time, there is one more expenditure the central government does on states, which is for this Viksit Bharat. अब इसका नाम विकसित भारत इस बार पड़ा है, लेकिन ये स्कीम पुरानी है. This is the COVID scheme. COVID के टाइम ये स्कीम आई थी, which was central government provides loans to states, given that states undertake certain reforms. Conditional loan to state. Center lends to states given that states undertake certain reforms. For example, state power sector में reform करे, अपनी distribution companies को independent बनाए, power distribution companies उनका loan कम करे. States one nation one ration, मालूम है ना scheme? One nation one ration card schemes को implement करें. So these are some conditions that center imposes upon states and says, if you implement these reforms, we will lend additional money to you interest free for a long term. So states are being nudged to undertake certain reforms, and that corpus of money the center is lending has now increased to around 75k crores. Center is lending this much amount of money to states for a long term based on certain desirable reforms that they undertake. So this is one more expense to states. Okay? Chalo. Now we'll start with debt financing, last part. Debt and deficit. Before that, if anybody has any question, pucho. Expenses se related. expenses, trends, components, revenue expense, capital expense. अगर किसी को कुछ पूछना है तो पूछो. अरे पूछो यार. Our purpose is that this should be interactive session. So you should be asking some questions. बोलो.
Difference between VGF and revamped VGF.
Revamped VGF यार मुझे पता नहीं क्या है, लेकिन मैं guess कर सकता हूँ क्या होगा. कुछ है revamped VGF?
ग्रांट का कंपोनेंट था कुछ ऐसा इसमें.
नहीं. I don't know what is revamped VGF. First, honest confession. Second, I can take a guess what would be revamped VGF. It would simply be that the manner of making a project viable would be different this time. जैसे उड़ान स्कीम में सरकार ने बोला कि we are not going to levy airport development charges. Versus in revamped VGF, government will say we will make the land available to your subsidized price. तो कोई और किसी और तरीके से किसी प्रोजेक्ट को वायबल बनाना, तो वो होना चाहिए रिवैम्प्ड VGF में. अब ये मैं गेस कर रहा हूँ, मेरे को उत्तर इसका नहीं पता है. ठीक है. और कोई सवाल?
Can Indian state borrow from other countries?
You should know the answer to this question.
If there is any outstanding loan.
No.
कौन सा आर्टिकल है बताओ? 293. ये पॉलिटी का सवाल है. Indian state governments, please, states cannot borrow directly from outside the country. ठीक है. अब चलो, रथ चलाए तो परस्पर बात भी चलेगी. 2015, Indian government allowed states to borrow directly. Article 293 prohibits that states cannot borrow from outside. That is the rule. एग्जाम में आएगा तो यही मार्क करना है. Listen again. States cannot borrow from outside the country. That is the rule. Article 293 Constitution bars it. Second, to ease money available to states from international financing institutions such as World Bank, central government allowed that states, given certain conditions, can then directly negotiate loans with foreign borrowers, foreign lenders, but then ultimately permission will have to come from center. जैसे झारखंड को मान लो negotiate करना है loan, झारखंड wants to borrow money for development of for some, let's say, developmental program like addressing malnourishment in some districts. World Bank is willing to lend to Jharkhand for this purpose. So Jharkhand and World Bank can directly negotiate a loan. लेकिन हाँ, जब वर्ल्ड बैंक लेंड करेगा तो वो लेंड तो सेंटर की परमिशन के बाद ही करेगा, तो इट कैन नॉट डायरेक्टली लेंड. सो एन इम्पॉर्टेंट रिफॉर्म फॉर बोरिंग फॉर स्टेट्स, बोरिंग बाय स्टेट्स फॉर फ्रॉम आउटसाइड द कंट्री. दे आर बार्ड, बट नाउ देर आर ग्रेटर फ्लेक्सिबिलिटीज गिवन टू देम बाय द सेंटर. ठीक है, चलो लास्ट पार्ट बोलो. वहां पे देना पीछे माइक.
सर वो जो स्टेट मतलब बोरो करेगा दूसरे कंट्री से या फिर दूसरे किसी इंस्टीट्यूशन से, तो उसका गारंटी हम लोग का सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट लेती है. मतलब
इसीलिए ही रिक्वायर्ड है कि स्टेट हमेशा सेंटर की परमिशन से बोरो करे, बिकॉज इट इज अ डेट ऑफ द कंट्री, एक सॉवरन डेट का पार्ट बन जाता है. दैट इज वाई स्टेट्स आर नॉट अलाउड टू बोरो डायरेक्टली फ्रॉम आउटसाइड द कंट्री. But if states fulfill certain conditions, then they can negotiate these loans with the foreign borrower, foreign lender, and then with the permission of center, they can borrow money, making it easier. पहले क्या होता था? पहले center would borrow, states had no power. Center would borrow from World Bank, and then center would decide कि ये पैसा किसको जाना है. This is fiscal federalism. Cooperative federalism. Earlier, center would borrow from World Bank, and then center would decide where will this money be spent in Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand or Rajasthan. Where will this money be spent? Now, Chhattisgarh government can directly go and talk to World Bank that we want this loan. World Bank can agree to provide that loan to Chhattisgarh government, And because World Bank has agreed, therefore now World Bank can lend, but obviously center की permission यहाँ पे भी required होगी. तो अब the initiative comes from state, not from the center. So this is the key difference. Permission तो भी चाहिए, लेकिन initiative अब center की जगह states का भी हो सकता है. ठीक है?
सर मतलब स्टेट अगर फेल कर जाती है पैसे को देने से तो सेंटर मतलब देगी, मतलब
बिल्कुल देना पड़ेगा. अगर कोई फेल करता है तो जो गारंटी देगा उसी को पैसा देना पड़ेगा. इसीलिए तो मैंने बोला कंडीशंस हैं. अगर कुछ कंडीशन स्टेट फुलफिल करेगा तब उसको अलाउड है. ठीक है? अल्टीमेटली परमिशन तो वहीं से आनी है. ठीक है, बोलो जल्दी, बात नहीं करो, जल्दी बोलो.
हेलो सर.
अरे एक सेकेंड, जल्दी बोलो जल्दी
सर.
अरे एक सेकेंड यार, कहाँ से आवाज आ रही है? कौन सर बोल रहा है? कहाँ छुप के बैठे हो? अरे एक मिनट रुको, तुम यहाँ पे पहले बोलो.
ओके ओके
सर स्टेट पीएसयूज के थ्रू बोरो कर सकती है?
स्टेट पीएसयूज के थ्रू मतलब बाहर से?
यस सर.
नहीं नहीं, पीएसयू अल्टीमेटली इज पार्ट ऑफ स्टेट. नो, अगेन वो ऐसे डॉक्ट्रिन ऑफ, वो क्या बोलते हैं उसको, व्हाट यू कांट डू डायरेक्टली यू कांट डू इनडायरेक्टली. कलरेबल लेजिस्लेशन. हाँ, यू कांट डू इनडायरेक्टली. लास्ट क्वेश्चन बोलो. यस
सर, सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट और स्टेट गवर्नमेंट इलेक्शन के टाइम फार्मर्स का लोन को वेव अप कर देती है, माफ़ कर देती है, तो उस लॉस को फिर बजट में कैसे हम लोग एडजस्ट करती है सरकार?
उस लॉस को बजट में कैसे एडजस्ट करते हैं?
क्योंकि वो रेवेन्यू तो जनरेट होगा ना, फार्मर तो देगी.
पहली बात तो वो लॉस नहीं है, उसको बोलो एक्सपेंडिचर है. सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट स्पेंड्स मनी. इट स्पेंड्स मनी एज पार्ट ऑफ सम स्कीम. It will come with, let's say, quote unquote, some loan waiver scheme, and it spends money. Loan waiver is announced till now. अभी तक तो ऐसा ही हुआ कि स्टेट गवर्नमेंट अनाउंस करती है, तो स्टेट जब चुनाव जीत के आएगी सरकार, वो बजट बनाएगी और उस बजट में बोलेगी हमने लोन वेवर के लिए इतना पैसा खर्च किया है. दैट विल पार्ट ऑफ स्टेट्स रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंसेस. ठीक है? ओके. डेफिसिट ट्रेंड्स.
सर
नहीं, अब नहीं यार, प्लीज इधर देखो. We have these various deficits: fiscal, revenue, ERD, and primary deficit. Question may be with respect to arrange the following deficits in order of magnitude. You see, fiscal, revenue, effective revenue, and primary. यहाँ तक प्राइमरी सबसे नीचे था, अब इफेक्टिव रेवेन्यू सबसे नीचे है. ये ट्रेंड्स हमको ऑब्जर्व करने हैं. ट्रेंड्स एज इन, फॉर एग्जाम्पल, सिंपली अरेंज द फॉलोइंग इन ऑर्डर ऑफ मैग्नीट्यूड. When you see, for example, fiscal deficit is this is primary, this is revenue, this is primary, and this becomes effective revenue. तो ये इस टाइप से चीजें तुमको ऑब्जर्व करनी है. Quickly, what is fiscal deficit? जल्दी बता दो. What is deficit? Excess of expenses over your receipts. What you have to spend versus what you have. What you have is less, what you require to spend is more. That means you are in a deficit, number one. Number two, there are various ways to visualize this deficit. You visualize it as, most broadly speaking, fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit क्या है? Fiscal deficit is government's total expenses which exceed its total non-debt receipts. सरकार की नॉन डेट मतलब नॉन बोरिंग रिसीट्स. नॉन डेट रिसीट से सरकार का टोटल एक्सपेंडिचर कितना जाता है, दैट बिकम्स इज फिस्कल डेफिसिट. इट्स फाइनेंसेस आर इन डेफिसिट बाय दिस नंबर. गवर्नमेंट सेज दैट वी एक्सपेक्ट टू स्पेंड 150 rupees next year, and from our taxes, our fines, our fees, our disinvestments, our collection of loans, from all these sources we are going to collect, let's say, 120 rupees. 150 हमको स्पेंड करना है, 120 हमारे पास होगा, मतलब वी आर इन डेफिसिट ऑफ 30 rupees. दिस कॉल्ड एज फिस्कल डेफिसिट. How is fiscal deficit financed? By borrowing. You are going to borrow money. That means fiscal deficit becomes equal to your borrowing in a particular year. इस साल कितना borrow कर रहे हो? Whatever your FD is, that becomes the amount of borrowing of this year. Fiscal deficit is excess of your expenses over non-debt receipts. नॉन डेट मतलब बिना बोरो की हुई रिसीट्स कितनी है आपकी, फ्रॉम ऑल सोर्सेज, फ्रॉम कैपिटल रेवेन्यू सोर्सेज, योर टोटल नॉन डेट रिसीट्स कितनी है वर्सेस योर टोटल एक्सपेंसेस कितने हैं. द डिफरेंस बिकम्स एफडी. एंड हाउ डू यू फाइनेंस इट? यू फाइनेंस इट बाय बोरोइंग मनी. यू विल बोरो फ्रॉम मेनी सोर्सेज. यू विल बोरो फ्रॉम आरबीआई, यू विल बोरो फ्रॉम मार्केट, यू विल बोरो फ्रॉम पब्लिक, यू आर गोइंग टू बोरो फ्रॉम मेनी सोर्सेज. जितना भी डेफिसिट है उसको आप बोरो करोगे इस साल. So FD becomes equal to total borrowing in a particular year, right? That is what FD is. Government borrows money, fiscal deficit. Total expenses minus total non-debt receipts. Central government lends money as well. जब सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट पैसा लेंड करती है तो वो कौन सा एक्सपेंडिचर है? सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट लेंड्स to UP government, to Nepal government, to a PSU. Central government may lend money as well. It is capital expenditure. Had central government not lent money, अगर सेंटर ने पैसा लेंड नहीं किया होता, हाइपोथेटिकल किया है कि नहीं किया है? फैक्ट है, सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट ने पैसा लेंड किया है. सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट हैज लेंट मनी to other states, to other countries, to some PSU, to anybody. It has lent money to someone. Fact is, it has lent money. Hypothetically, had the central government not lent money itself, then center's expenses would have been less or not. अगर सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट पैसा लेंड नहीं कर रही होती खुद, तो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट के टोटल एक्सपेंस कम होते कि नहीं होते? कम होते. If its total expenses would have been less, then its need to borrow would have been more or less? Less. How much it would have borrowed had it not lent itself? अगर अपने आप सेंटर ने लेंड नहीं किया होता, तब सेंटर ने कितना बोरो किया होता? That is called as which deficit? Primary. That is primary deficit. Sorry. Net fiscal deficit. Gross fiscal versus net fiscal. Sorry, I'll repeat. Central government incurs total expenses, revenue expense and capital expense. Central government has total non-debt receipts. Let's call them as NDR, non-debt receipts. FD is TE minus NDR. ये तो क्या हमारा fiscal deficit. Total expense minus non-debt receipts. ना आउट ऑफ टोटल एक्सपेंस हम क्या देख रहे हैं? सरकार का जो टोटल एक्सपेंडिचर है उसमें से एक पार्ट को कम कर देते हैं. कौन से पार्ट को? अगर सेंटर ने खुद आगे लेंड नहीं किया होता तो. Had the central government not lend itself, that means its need for borrowing itself would have been less. Why? Because its total expenses would have been less. How much would the central government be in a deficit had it not itself lent money? That is called as net fiscal deficit. वो तो क्या हमारा NFD. क्लियर है सबको NFD क्या है? नेक्स्ट कम्स प्राइमरी PD. सेंटर का मेजर एक्सपेंस कौन सा है? इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट. इंटरेस्ट इज पेड ऑन व्हाट? डेट, प्रीवियस बोरोइंग्स. Modi ji is paying interest on borrowings made by Manmohan Singh ji, by Vajpayee ji, by Rajiv Gandhi ji, by everybody else in past. The central government is liable to pay interest on its debt. It can't say that I did not borrow this money and hence I am not going to pay this interest. It has to pay interest. Again, hypothetical. Had the central government not paid an interest, had the central government not been liable to pay an interest, hypothetical, तो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट का एक्सपेंडिचर कम होता कि नहीं होता? एक्सपेंसेस वुड हैव बीन लेस. हाउ मच डेफिसिट वुड द सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट बी इन हैड इट नॉट बीन लायबल टू पे इंटरेस्ट ऑन बोरिंग्स ऑफ पास्ट? तब कितना डेफिसिट होता अगर सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट was not liable to pay interest on borrowings of past? That is called as primary deficit. Primary is fiscal deficit minus interest payment. तो हो गया हमारा PD, primary deficit. क्लियर हो सबको क्या है primary deficit? रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट क्या होगा? डेफिसिट ऑन रेवेन्यू अकाउंट. सिंपली रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंसेस कितने ज्यादा हैं रेवेन्यू रिसीट से, दैट इज रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट. इफेक्टिव रेवेन्यू क्या है? अब बोलो किसने पूछा था? इफेक्टिव रेवेन्यू इज एक्सपेंडिचर में से वो वाले ग्रांट्स माइनस करने, वो स्पेशल ट्रीटमेंट वाले ग्रांट्स जो थे. सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट्स रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंसेस इंक्लूड ऑल काइंड ऑफ एक्सपेंसेस on states. Some of those expenses are such that they are meant for creation of capital assets. Subtract those expenses. Revenue expense में से subtract expenses given to states for creation of capital assets. What does that become? That becomes effective revenue deficit. sorry. Revenue expense में से subtract expenses to states for creation of capital assets. जो हमने पहले देखा था ना, capital assets. Subtract this from revenue expenses and then see how much does this number exceed your revenue receipt. This becomes your effective revenue deficit ERD. FRBM Act में क्या टारगेट है? अब ये है प्रीलिम्स के सवाल. What is the objective under FRBM Act? Fiscal deficit has to be reduced to 3% of GDP. वो तो रोड मैप है कि कैसे पहुंचोगे वहां तक. Objective is to reduce fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP. We have to specify in what terms. 3% of what? 3% of GDP. 1. And to eliminate revenue deficit, RD को eliminate करना है, मतलब revenue expenses should not be in excess of revenue receipts. FRBM Act was modified to change the target from RD to ERD. अब हमारा टारगेट रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट को एलिमिनेट करने का नहीं है. द टारगेट इज टू एलिमिनेट इफेक्टिव रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट ERD. So this is what ERD is. That is why the special treatment to this thing. Objective under FRBM is to 1, reduce fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP, and second, to eliminate effective revenue deficit, not revenue deficit now. ठीक है? That is why the special treatment. Trends देख सकते हो. Target for FD is 3%. कितना FD है हमारा? देखो यहाँ पे. अरे 5.1 तो अगले साल का प्रोजेक्टेड है. इस साल कितना है? 5.8. Last year it was 5. Last year it was 6.4. Government projected when presenting last year's budget. जब बजट लास्ट ईयर प्रेजेंट किया था, सरकार ने प्रोजेक्ट किया था कि हम अगले साल 5.9 पे होंगे. Versus actual this year, as in revised estimate this year, is that we are going to overachieve our target. Now this has happened probably for the first time in many years. We projected that we will be at 5.9% of GDP next year. ये last year जब बजट प्रेजेंट कर रहे हैं तब क्या है? ये बजट एस्टिमेट है BE of 23-24. We projected that we will be at 5.9%, but we are expected to be at 5.8% this year. 5.8% of GDP is our expected fiscal deficit this year. That means we are overshooting our target. हम अपना FD और कम कर रहे हैं. And next year we plan to bring it down to 5.1%, so that next year estimate for 25-26 वो कितना है? 4.5%. Our immediate target which we set last year was to bring fiscal deficit from 6.8, 6.3 ultimately to 4.5. 4.5 के लिए हमने road map दिया that how are we going to reach this 4.5. Our road map was that next year we'll be at 5.9, next year at 5.1, and then next year at 4.5. This year we have overshot to 5.8. So our FD is less than what we expected it to be. Question: why is fiscal deficit less? FD as a percentage of GDP is equal to 5.8%. Fiscal deficit is 5.8% of GDP. बताओ क्या कारण हो सकता है? ये प्रीलिम्स का सवाल है. Can be one reason. Or what else? Tax collection higher, yes. Again, need for borrowing is less. Okay, what else? सवाल सबको समझ में आ रहा है? Question is, our target was that we are going to bring down fiscal deficit to 5.9% GDP, and surprisingly good, we have been able to bring it down to further to 5.8% of GDP. Why do you think? What made this thing possible? So फॉरेन इन्वेस्टमेंट से तो फिर एज इन नीड टू बोरिंग और कम हो जाएगी सरकार की. बोलो बोलो बोलो. वी मैनेज्ड चीपर बॉन्ड्स, चीपर बोरोइंग्स, बट वो तो फिस्कल प्रिंसिपल अमाउंट आ रहा है ना, इंटरेस्ट थोड़ी ना आ रहा है.
So GDP is constantly increasing.
That is the reason. The reason for fall in fiscal deficit. Again देखो, यही mathematical सवाल और ये common questions हैं prelims में. When I look at these questions in exam, when I take the discussion of prelims for you, I assume कि ये सवाल attemptable सवाल है. Because I believe that these questions, if you simply understand the concept, बहुत ही आसान सा concept है, और आप अगर उसको अप्लाई करने की कोशिश करते हो तो चांसेस आर, मुझे नहीं लगता है कि आप उस सवाल को गलत कर पाओगे, क्योंकि आपको सिंपली चीज को पढ़ना है और पढ़ के उसको खोल के देखना कि ये क्या चीज है. फिस्कल डेफिसिट इज इक्वल्स टू 5.8% ऑफ जीडीपी, मीनिंग लेट्स से आवर जीडीपी इज इक्वल्स टू 100 रुपीज, आवर बोरोइंग दिस ईयर इज इक्वल्स टू 5.8 रुपीज. ये हो गया ना फिस्कल डेफिसिट. बोरोइंग दिस ईयर इज 5.8, गिवन जीडीपी इज 100. वी बोरो 5.8 रुपीज, हमने इतना ही बोरो किया है, लेकिन इस साल हमारी जीडीपी 100 की जगह 110 हो गई है. व्हाट विल हैपन टू फिस्कल डेफिसिट एज अ परसेंटेज ऑफ जीडीपी? विल फॉल और नॉट? FD was 5.8 upon 100 versus now it will be 5.8 upon 110. हमने बोरो तो उतना ही किया है, we are borrowing the same amount, but the denominator is now bigger. Economy is growing faster than expected. अभी आए थे ना एक महीने पहले इकोनॉमी के एस्टिमेट्स, जीडीपी के एस्टिमेट्स. We estimated that GDP was growing by, RBI was estimating that Indian economy will grow by 7.1%, versus we surprised on the upside by growing at 7.6%. So GDP grows faster. GDP grows faster. That means the denominator बड़ा हो रहा है कि नहीं हो रहा है? This question has been asked in the exam, not with respect to FD, but with respect to current account deficit. But वो उसमें CAD FD मैटर नहीं करता है, उसमें सिंपली मैटर करता है कि आप ये सिंपल मैथमेटिक्स देख पा रहे हो कि नहीं. This is more of a maths question, as in and a simple maths question. Something as a percentage of something. Simply the denominator is rising fast. That means the number, the fraction that you see is going to fall down. Our GDP growth, question, simple question, GDP grows faster. Even though the government borrows same amount, fiscal deficit will now be less or not as a percentage of GDP. This is what is happening here. Our GDP has grown faster, as a result of which our FD as a percentage of GDP now is less. So this is the reason for this. Not that we are borrowing less, but we are borrowing less and the economy is growing faster than expected. जब यहाँ पे हमने बजट प्रेजेंट किया था तब अज्यूम किया था कि इकोनॉमी ग्रो करेगी लेट्स से 10% पर, लेकिन इकोनॉमी सही में ग्रो करी एट लेट्स से 11%. हेंस द नंबर फॉल्स. राइट? क्लियर? ओके. Sources of deficit financing. From where does government finance its deficit? Again simple सवाल है, सरकार कहाँ से पैसा बोरो कर सकती है? The biggest source of money for government is, कहां से बोरो करती है सरकार? अरे कहां से बोरो करती है, बोरोइंग्स मत बोलो. Favorite question of UPSC. Pick up last 10 years paper, you will find one question regarding government's debt. Where does government borrow from? What is the proportion of internal debt to external debt? In which currency is external debt denominated? Short term debt, long term debt. लास्ट 10 साल का पेपर उठा लो, एक भी साल ऐसा नहीं है जहां पे इस डेट के ऊपर सवाल नहीं पूछा गया है. हर साल सवाल है डेट के ऊपर, हर साल. इंटरनल, एक्सटर्नल, सोर्स ऑफ बोरोइंग, टर्म ऑफ बोरोइंग, करेंसी ऑफ बोरोइंग, एवरी ईयर देयर इज अ क्वेश्चन विदाउट फेल. वेयर डज गवर्नमेंट मोस्टली बोरो इट्स मनी फ्रॉम? वन, इंटरनल डेट. Around 92% of our debt is from internal sources. Government of India borrows from the domestic market. Very less is from outside the country, number one. Even the debt which is from outside the country, जो बाहर से, जो हमारा Government of India का जो external debt है, even that debt, most of that debt is in rupees, not in foreign currency. मोस्ट ऑफ अवर गवर्नमेंट, सरकार का, अब मैं देश का नहीं बोलूं, देश और सरकार अलग अलग चीज है. देश का डेट वर्सेस सरकार का डेट. आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट गवर्नमेंट्स डेट, नॉट कंट्रीज डेट. Most of government's debt from external sources is rupee denominated debt. So one, most of our debt, government debt, is from internal sources. Second, most of external debt is denominated in rupees. Most of internal debt comes from marketable securities, meaning basically government bonds and bills, treasury bills. Around 90% of total debt is coming from our market borrowings. देखो, this is securities against small saving or short term borrowing, and these are the other component जो बहुत छोटा सा part है, very less other component. Most of our borrowing is coming from marketable securities which are backed by some sort of asset. This is our total government borrowing. Government borrowing mostly comes from marketable securities. ठीक है, मार्केट से marketable security, government bond, समझते हो government bond? Government issues bond or government issues treasury bills, it sells them in the market. Anybody can buy, I can buy, you can buy, RBI can buy, Reliance Industries can buy, SBI can buy, anyone can buy, FIIs can buy, कोई भी खरीद सकता है. जब FIIs गवर्नमेंट का बॉन्ड खरीदते हैं, a foreigner is buying government of India bond. गवर्नमेंट बॉन्ड कौन सी करेंसी में लिखा होगा? रुपी में, डॉलर में? रुपीज में लिखा होगा. I am purchasing government bonds face values, let's say 1000 rupees. That means I am lending 1000 rupees to the government. RBI is buying, RBI is lending 1000 rupees to the government. SBI is buying, SBI lends 1000 rupees to the government. Warren Buffett is buying, he's lending 1000 rupees to the government. Anybody buys government of India's bond because government bond is denominated in rupees, a domestic currency. That means that is a domestic currency, rupee debt. An Indian can buy internal debt, a foreigner can buy external debt. अब समझ में आ रहा है that why is most of government's debt, external debt, also in rupees? Because government debt is issued mostly via marketable security, that is government bond or GSEC और treasury bills. सरकार बॉन्ड प्रिंट करती है और मार्केट में सेल करती है. ये सरकार का सोर्स ऑफ डेट है. और इस डेट को कोई भी परचेज, इस बॉन्ड को कोई भी, एनीबडी कैन परचेज दीज बॉन्ड्स, अ फॉरेनर और एन इंडियन. एनीबडी बायस, इफ अ फॉरेनर बायस, दैट बिकम्स इंडियन गवर्नमेंट्स डेट टू एन एक्सटर्नल एंटिटी. इफ एन इंडियन बायस, इट बिकम्स इंडियन गवर्नमेंट डेट टू अ डोमेस्टिक एंटिटी, इंटरनल एंटिटी. And therefore, most of government's debt is rupee denominated, even though some of it is external debt. Clear है? These are sources. अच्छा, रिवैम्ड स्कीम, ओके, फाइन, क्लियर, सबको आगे समझ में? गवर्नमेंट्स डेट सस्टेनेबिलिटी. हाउ डू वी असेस, एकदम लास्ट पार्ट है, फिर हम एंड कर रहे हैं. हाउ डू वी असेस whether government's debt is sustainable or not? हमारा फिस्कल डेफिसिट ऑफ 5.9, 5.8 सस्टेनेबल है या नहीं है, ये कैसे असेस करते हैं?
Sir, it should be.
अरे हाँ बोलो. Yes.
So it should be incurred on least cost.
हाँ, yes.
And in rupee denominated.
Preferably.
And from domestic sources.
Preferably,
and
yes.
From it should be the maturity of longer period.
Good.
And it should be the interest rate should be lesser than the expected growth rate of the.
Very good. Good. Excellent. चलो खत्म. Last part, how do we assess sustainability of government's debt? गवर्नमेंट ने इस साल फिस्कल डेफिसिट इनकर किया ऑफ 5.8%. अब 5.8 सस्टेनेबल है या 5.7 था या 5.4 था या 3 है या 8 है, कितना सस्टेनेबल है? गवर्नमेंट का टोटल डेट कितना है? व्हेन आई यूज द वर्ड टोटल डेट, व्हाट डज इट मीन? इस समय टोटल आउटस्टैंडिंग कितना है? 5.8% ऑफ जीडीपी वाज व्हाट वाज इनकर्ड दिस ईयर. लेकिन लास्ट ईयर भी तो बोरो किया था, उससे पहले भी बोरो किया था, उससे पहले भी बोरो किया था, जिसमें से अभी सारा पे थोड़ी ना किया है. एज आई सेड, जैसे भी बोला था कि मोदी जी इज पेइंग इंटरेस्ट ऑन बोरोइंग्स डन बाय मनमोहन सिंह जी, बाय वाजपेयी जी, बाय नरसिम्हा राव जी, बाय राजीव गांधी. ही इज पेइंग इंटरेस्ट ऑन ऑल दोस बॉन्ड्स. दैट मीन्स दैट डेट इज स्टिल अनपेड और नॉट. दिस ईयर मोदी जी इज बोरोइंग 5 rupees, But last year he himself borrowed 6 rupees. Last year, before that, he borrowed 5 rupees. Before that, Manmohan Singh ji borrowed some 10 rupees, out of which 7 rupees is still to be paid. Is samay, at this moment, at this point of time, what is the total outstanding of Government of India? पहले बताओ ऐसे variables को क्या बोलते हैं? What are such variables called, which are measured at a point of time? Stock variables. Stock versus flow. Flow measured over a period of time. Deficit is a flow variable. How much is the government deficit in during this year? Versus stock. At one point of time, सरकार का कितना debt है? मतलब total outstanding कितना है? That is what government debt is. So government's debt, इस समय सरकार का debt कितना है? Percentage term में अगर देखा जाए तो around 82% of GDP. That is total debt of the government today. Its deficit this year is 5.8%, but its total debt is around 82% of GDP. So whether this deficit, which contributes to debt, whether it is sustainable or not, हमको ये भी check करना होता है. Government is bound by FRBM Act to reduce it ultimately to 3%, but it can't simply reduce it in one go to 3%. उसको step by step में जाना पड़ेगा. How does government see? One, the government sees that whatever the debt is, it is incurred at least cost. Second, it sees whether the debt was incurred from domestic sources or foreign sources. Third, it sees whether foreign debt is incurred in rupees or in foreign currency. Fourth, it sees that whether the maturity profile of debt is long or short. Maturity profile मतलब क्या है कि कब वापस करना है. अगर डेट प्रिंसिपल अमाउंट, अगर प्रिंसिपल शॉर्ट टर्म में वापस करना है वर्सेस लॉन्ग टर्म में वापस करना है. प्रिंसिपल अमाउंट इज बिग और इंटरेस्ट अमाउंट इज बिग. प्रिंसिपल अमाउंट ऑब्वियसली, इंटरेस्ट इज जस्ट अ स्मॉल पार्ट ऑफ प्रिंसिपल. If government has to repay principal in short term, that means there is going to be a huge expenditure burden upon the government or not. Meaning government will not be able to spend for certain necessary purposes because if there is a principal that has to be repaid. Versus I lend money to you for 1 week versus for 1 year. ज़्यादा रिस्क कहाँ पर है? लॉन्ग टर्म में या शॉर्ट टर्म में? लॉन्ग टर्म में. Long term has more risk as compared to short term. That means given other things as equal, when will I charge high rate of interest? When I lend to you for long term or short term? Long term में ज़्यादा interest I'm going to charge. Why? Because more risk. I'm exposed to more. I'm lending money to you for longer term. In short duration, only limited number of things can go wrong. In long duration, anything can go wrong. That means more risk when lending for longer duration. Hence, interest rate would be charge would be higher for long term. अगर सरकार आज बोरो करती है तो सरकार को दिख रहा है कि अगर लंबे समय के लिए बोरो करेंगे तो इंटरेस्ट ज्यादा पे करना पड़ेगा, कम करना पड़ेगा? ज्यादा करना पड़ेगा. For borrowing for shorter duration, you pay a less rate of interest. Do you see the trade-off here? If you borrow for shorter duration, you pay a less rate of interest. Versus if you borrow for shorter duration, you will have a greater repayment pressure also. That means I have to see when I borrow money, one, the cost is less. मैंने जो first principle बोला, cost should be less, but at the same time, I must see whether borrowing only at less cost is desirable or not. अगर मैंने कम cost के चक्कर में short term debt ले लिया, that will lead to me having a redemption pressure, मतलब a payment pressure in short duration, meaning I may have to cut down on my necessary expenses in short term. Hence, we assess debt's maturity profile. Government का debt कितने time में mature हो रहा है? Let's say right now I look at my debt. I see that 20% of my debt is maturing in next 5 years, short term, versus 80% is maturing in more than 5 years. Meaning I have some breathing space. अगर मैं आज कुछ short term debt ले लेता हूँ, if I take some debt today which is going to mature in short term, 20% ही मेरा total debt है वो short term में mature हो रहा है. इसका मतलब मेरे ऊपर इतना ज़्यादा redemption pressure नहीं होगा short term के लिए. So I can borrow for a shorter duration today. Versus today if I see that 60% of my debt is maturing in short term. That means there is going to be a huge redemption pressure, meaning huge principal repayment pressure that I'm going to be exposed to in the short duration. Hence, अगर मैं आज short term के लिए debt ले लेता हूँ, मतलब मैं अपने ऊपर pressure और बढ़ा रहा हूँ short term में पैसा देने का. So when we borrow money, we look at the maturity profile of debt as well. This is how we assess debt's sustainability. So we look at maturity profile of debt as well. So when we look at government's maturity profile, most of its debt is today long term in nature. Therefore, the very last part, बस 2 minutes और. Our debt is one, mostly incurred from domestic sources. Second, mostly incurred in domestic currency. Third, mostly of long term in nature. Therefore, our debt should be regarded as sustainable or unsustainable. Sustainable in nature, number one. Number two, our deficit has been on the declining trend, meaning we are borrowing less, we are mending our finances. So our debt right now is sustainable. And second, our deficit, meaning need to borrow in future, also looks like it is declining. That means we are a worthy candidate for borrowing money or an unworthy candidate. Worthy, एक अच्छे ग्राहक हैं. If your debt profile, आपने इस समय कुछ borrow कर रखा है, you go to the bank to borrow money, the bank will assess कि आप एक अच्छे ग्राहक हो या खराब ग्राहक हो. बैंक देखा कि आपकी current debt sustainability क्या है. It will be assessed that your incomes are rising. That means in future you need to borrow less first. Second, it will be assessed that your current debt is such that you have a capability to repay. That means bank will assess that you are a good customer. Hence, bank should lend to you at a high cost or at a low cost. Low cost. Versus when Indian government borrows, despite we having a sustainable debt, despite we having a falling fiscal deficit, we are still able to borrow only at higher costs. Why? Because rating agencies do not rate us that well. वो बोलती हैं, rating agencies बोलती हैं कि इंडिया का जो debt है वो unsustainable है. Even though our debt to GDP ratio is 82%. America's is 110%. China's around 105%. Japan's around 220%. Their debt is around 2 times their GDP. America's debt is more than 1 time, as in more than double their GDP. Versus our debt is on the lower side, is on the sustainable side, and is on the declining side. And still, we are able to borrow money at a higher cost. Hence, a continued focus, and that too in the budget as well, on rating agencies कि हमारा debt जो है वो sustainable है. We always make it a point to emphasize that our debt is sustainable. Hence, our cost of debt must come down. Rating agencies must rate us in a more fair manner, as in not treat us unfairly, but rating our debt unsecure or risky. They must rate us in a more fair manner. So this is the last point with respect to debt sustainability. ठीक है? This is about budget analysis. अभी रुको. Q&A. किसी को कोई सवाल पूछना है? जल्दी मत करना जाने की, और सुनो, इतनी 3 घंटे से ऊपर बैठे हो तुम लोग. ठीक है, अब 5 मिनट और रुक जाओ. अगर किसी को कोई सवाल है तो उसकी रिस्पेक्ट करो. तो इसलिए प्लीज डोंट रश, प्लीज डोंट क्रिएट इनडिसिप्लिन, जस्ट वेट फॉर 5 more minutes. ठीक है, प्लीज बात नहीं करना, बोलो.
So you said interim budget can be for whole year or part of it.
Please don't talk, यार. Please give respect to the person. Interim budget can be
for whole part or
whole year or part
whole year or part of it. Then sir, if it is for whole year, though all the things are not included in the budget, interim budget, so how the things take place if it's going to take part for whole year?
Good, really good. So no, government has proposed the interim budget. Let us assume this will be passed. होना ही है, सरकार majority में तो pass होना ही है. One, let us say कि 26 मई को जब रिजल्ट आएंगे, जब तुम पेपर दे रहे हो उस दिन चुनाव का रिजल्ट नहीं, रिजल्ट तो पहले आ जाएगा 10-15 दिन पहले. Anyway, let us say we have a hung parliament. Let us say no government is able to win a clear majority, no party is able to win a clear majority, and nobody is able to decide as to who is going to form the government. Because government has not yet been formed, therefore will expenses stop or expenses continue to be incurred. Expenses तो होने ही है ना, चाहे सरकार बने चाहे नहीं बने, expenses तो होने ही है. तो तब फिर expenses किस तरीके से हो पाएंगे? What gives them the authorization? The interim budget passed will give them the authorization. Because the interim budget has been passed, it may well be valid for the entire year. Because a bill has been passed, that means it is valid. But because chances are this is not going to happen, some or the other party will be in a majority, they will present then a full-fledged budget. So therefore, in this interim budget, the outgoing government generally restrains from presenting some major schemes or document. लेकिन फिर भी एक्सपेंडिचर तो पूरे साल का ही पास हो जाएगा. ठीक है, चलो और कोई सवाल?
Sir.
Please बोलो.
Sir, on central government loans, the interest received is revenue receipt, but the principal received is capital.
Yes. Yes. Interest received by center would be revenue receipt, but principal receipt would be capital receipt. देखो, सेशन के बाद अब मेरे को पकड़ के सवाल मत पूछना. अभी मैं तुमको बार बार मौका दे रहा हूँ कि सवाल पूछने के लिए. तो बाद में नहीं पूछना कि ये पढ़ लें, ये पढ़ लें, ये नहीं पढ़ें. जिसको कुछ भी पूछना है, क्या पढ़ना है क्या नहीं पढ़ना, अभी पूछ लो. बताओ, मन में कुछ डाउट है कि क्या बजट पढ़ लिया, हो गया खत्म बजट? ठीक है, यू आर रीडिंग न्यूज़पेपर्स एवरी डे, you will continue to see analysis of budget for next 5-6 days as well. So just read that, don't need to read anything else with respect to that. बोलो. डेफिसिट ट्रेंड्स,
मतलब यही पूछ रहा था सर कि पढ़ने की जो अप्रोच है, मतलब जो डेफिसिट ट्रेंड्स का आपने बताया था कि हमको जैसे एक हमको पैरामीटर मिला तो उसको हमको अलग अलग पैरामीटर के साथ कनेक्ट करना है, उसका प्रोपोर्शन ऐसे मैनेज करना है, भले उनका कोई मतलब ना हो, जैसे डेब्ट जीडीपी वगैरह डेफिसिट है, और न्यूमेरिकल वैल्यू की इतनी इंपॉर्टेंस. तो
दिस इज अगेन, दिस इज ये क्या है यार, दिस इज conceptual understanding. So when you look at these deficit trends, what you should look for is one, comparative deficits as in fiscal revenue, जिसमें से कौन सा बड़ा है कौन सा छोटा है, and more importantly the concept must be clear कि fiscal क्या है, revenue क्या है, effective revenue क्या है, primary क्या है, ये concepts clear होने चाहिए. Trend, ये तो visual memory यहाँ से याद हो जाएगा, that this it is consistently declining, it is every deficit is consistently declining. Next, you also know what the concepts are, you can arrange them in an order. When you have conceptual clarity, trust me, you will be able to attend these questions. ठीक है, याद नहीं करना है नंबर 5.8, 5.1 या 2.82, ये नंबर याद नहीं करना है.
और सर एक सवाल और ये था, मतलब तो ये एनालिसिस तो सर बजट समरी में भी मिल जाएगी ना, लेकिन आपने कहा था कि सर कई सारे फैक्ट्स हमको याद नहीं करने, हमको खुद से एनालिसिस करना है, तो मतलब वही अप्रोच रिलेटेड पूछ रहा था कैसे.
देखो, ये तो जो मेरे स्टूडेंट्स हैं सब लोग जानते भी हैं, मैं बोलता भी हूँ इस चीज़ को. आज की स्टार्टिंग की क्लास में बोला था कि 1, you can't remember all the facts, 2, you don't have to remember these facts. जैसे बजट समरी आपकी अपलोड की गई है, if you try to memorize that budget summary, you have lost it already. PT 365 will be given to you. If you try to memorize those facts, 1, आप एक सब्जेक्ट का भी पूरा नहीं पढ़ पाओगे. Your objective should be to read it, not to remember it. This is where your hard work of entire year is going to pay off. Trust that you have read all the newspapers during the year. You may have or may not have read, let's say, monthly current affairs. Now when you read PT 65 or let's say economic survey summary or let's say budget summary, then you are going to recollect all these trends in your mind without explicitly trying to remember them. एग्जाम में जब ये सवाल आएगा तब ट्रस्ट करो अपने आप को कि आप इसको मार्क कर पाओगे. लेकिन अगर आप याद करने के पीछे जाओगे तब आप एक भी डॉक्यूमेंट पूरा नहीं पढ़ पाओगे. स्कीम्स याद नहीं करनी है, जो स्कीम्स यहां पर है वो याद कर ली प्लीज. देन फ्रॉम नाउ ऑनवर्ड्स ट्रस्ट योरसेल्फ. ये पूछी गई एग्जाम में तो मैं मार्क कर दूंगा, ये गलत नहीं करूंगा. लेकिन कुछ और पूछी गई तो देन लेट सो बी इट. पीएम स्वनिधि आ गई एग्जाम में, पीएम जनमन आ गई एग्जाम में, वो गलत नहीं करना क्योंकि वो हमने क्लास में पढ़नी. यू हैव स्पेंट योर टाइम ऑन दैट, invested your time. But if there is some scheme that you have not spent your time, there is no point of going to the internet, looking at a document and then trying to remember all those things. It's not possible and it's not required also. So don't waste your time like that. Okay? Anything else? नहीं, जाओ, टेक केयर, बाय बाय.